The early 12th century, just after the First Crusade, when Jerusalem, the holiest city, had been wrestled from Muslim control. But the land around it, known as the Latin East or Outremer, was far from peaceful. It was a patchwork of newly established Crusader states, constantly under threat, surrounded by hostile forces, and struggling to maintain a foothold in a fiercely contested land. Think of it like a freshly baked, delicious cake left out on a picnic blanket, just begging to be swarmed by ants. Only these ants were seasoned warriors, and the stakes were far higher than a sugar rush. The pilgrims, those devout souls making the arduous journey to the Holy Land to visit sacred sites, faced unimaginable dangers. Bandits lurked in every shadow. Opportunistic raiders saw them as easy prey, and the vast, unforgiving landscape itself seemed to conspire against them, making safe passage a near impossibility. It was a truly perilous pilgrimage, one that often ended not in spiritual fulfillment, but in tragedy, robbery, or worse, leaving a trail of broken hopes and scattered bones across the dusty roads leading to Jerusalem. Now, into this precarious scene steps a man named Hugh de Payens, a minor French nobleman who, along with 8 other knights, made a radical proposal that would echo through centuries. They would dedicate themselves to protecting these vulnerable pilgrims, to serve as a kind of armed escort, a shield against the relentless perils of the road. It wasn't about conquering new lands or amassing personal fortunes, at least not initially. Their vow was simple yet profound: to defend pilgrims, to live a life of poverty, chastity, and obedience, like monks, but with swords instead of psalters, a blend of monastic piety and martial prowess that was, frankly, revolutionary for its time. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, though you might know them better by their catchier, more famous moniker, the Knights Templar, a name that would soon become synonymous with both immense power and an equally immense tragic fall. At first, they were so poor, legend has it, that 2 knights often shared a single horse. A rather comical image if you picture heavily armored men trying to coordinate a charge on one nag. And this humble beginning is truly remarkable when you consider the vast wealth and influence they would later command. Historians still argue whether their initial poverty was truly so dire, or if it was a clever piece of early branding, emphasizing their humility and devotion to attract support. But whatever their exact financial state, their dedication was clear, and they received initial support from King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, who, seeing the desperate need for such a protective force, granted them quarters within the revered Temple Mount, believed to be the site of Solomon's Temple, a location that lent them immediate prestige and a sense of divine purpose. This strategic placement, right in the heart of Jerusalem's spiritual and historical landscape, instantly elevated their status, connecting them directly to the very foundations of Christian faith in the Holy Land, and providing a powerful symbol for their nascent order. Their initial years, however, were anything but glamorous. They were few in number, struggling to make ends meet, and largely unrecognized by the wider church, operating more as a local vigilante group with good intentions than a formal, divinely sanctioned organization. They were, in essence, the original startup, operating on a shoestring budget, fueled by belief and hoping to gain traction. A bit like that obscure indie band before they hit the big time. Their days were filled with the gritty realities of protection. patrolling dangerous roads, confronting bandits, and ensuring the safety of those who otherwise would have faced almost certain doom on their spiritual journeys. Imagine the dust, the heat, the constant vigilance, the clash of steel, the desperate pleas of those they saved. This was their daily bread, their solemn duty. They weren't just warriors. They were guardians of faith, their very existence a testament to the desperate need for order in a chaotic world. The true turning point, the moment they transitioned from a humble band of dedicated knights to a major player on the European stage, came with the Council of Troyes in 1129. This was a big deal, a real coming-out party for the Templars, orchestrated by none other than Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential religious figures of the 12th century. A Cistercian abbot with a knack for persuasion and a deep belief in the Templars' mission, Bernard, a spiritual giant, saw in the Templars a new kind of knighthood, one that transcended the earthly pursuit of glory and embraced a higher sacred calling, a concept he passionately articulated in his Treatise de Laude Novae Militia. In praise of the new knighthood, he essentially became their chief marketing officer, tirelessly promoting their cause and vouching for their spiritual purity and military effectiveness to the highest echelons of the church. It was Bernard who successfully lobbied the Pope and other powerful church leaders, painting a compelling picture of these warrior monks as the true defenders of Christ's kingdom, a stark contrast to the often bloody and self-serving secular knights of the era. And what a success it was. The Council of Troyes officially recognized the order, granting them a unique rule written by Bernard himself, based on the Cistercian monastic rule, but adapted for military purposes, which solidified their structure, outlined their way of life, and most importantly, formally connected them to the Pope directly, granting them an unprecedented level of independence from local bishops and kings. This papal endorsement was everything. It gave them legitimacy, a clear legal framework, and the imprimatur of God himself, setting them apart from all other military orders and ordinary knightly fraternities. The humble band of 9 now had the official backing of the most powerful institution in Europe, and with that came something even more valuable than gold: a tide of enthusiastic recruits, donations of land and money from pious benefactors across Europe, and a rapid, almost astonishing growth in their numbers and influence. Suddenly, everyone wanted a piece of the Templar action, or at least to be associated with their holy cause, and the trickle of support became a flood, laying the groundwork for an organizational powerhouse that would soon span continents. So, with the Council of Troyes in 1129, the Knights Templar truly stepped onto the world stage, moving from a small, dedicated group to an organization with official papal recognition, and this endorsement was like rocket fuel for their growth. Imagine suddenly having the ultimate seal of approval from the most powerful spiritual authority in the Western world. It meant an instant influx of cash, land, and eager young men ready to fight for God, glory, and perhaps a little adventure. This recognition wasn't just symbolic. It came with concrete benefits, like exemptions from local taxes and tithes, which meant more resources could be poured directly into their military and charitable efforts, essentially creating a self-sustaining financial engine. Suddenly, donations flooded in from across Europe, from kings and queens, nobles and commoners, all eager to contribute to the holy cause of protecting pilgrims and defending the Holy Land. People left vast estates to the Templars in their wills, believing it would ensure their passage to heaven, turning the order into one of the largest landowners in Christendom, accumulating vast tracts of arable land, forests, and even entire villages. This rapid accumulation of wealth wasn't just about lavish living, far from it. It was meticulously managed and strategically deployed to fund their primary mission: military operations in Outremer and the establishment of a robust, self-sufficient infrastructure to support their knights. They weren't just receiving donations, they were actively building a sophisticated logistical network that stretched from the chilly shores of England to the sun-baked plains of Palestine. Think of it like a medieval multinational corporation, but instead of profit margins, their bottom line was the protection of the Holy Land. They established commanderies, or preceptories, across Western Europe, which served as administrative centers for their vast estates, recruiting hubs for new knights, and safe houses for pilgrims en route to the east. These commanderies were often fortified, acting as local power bases and centers of economic activity, turning fallow land into productive farms and managing complex agricultural operations that generated even more income for the order. The growth wasn't just financial, it was also numerical. Young men, fired by religious zeal and the promise of a glorious death in battle, flocked to join the Templars. These weren't just any recruits. They were trained knights, often from noble families, who brought their own arms, armor, and even their horses, effectively equipping the order at no direct cost to themselves. This influx of skilled warriors allowed the Templars to field increasingly large and well-trained armies, making them a formidable fighting force, perhaps the most disciplined and effective military unit in the Crusader states. Their distinct white mantle with the red cross became a universally recognized symbol of courage and piety, instilling fear in their enemies and hope in their allies. The image of a Templar knight, stoic and unyielding, became an iconic representation of Crusader ideals. A warrior monk who had renounced worldly pleasures for a higher purpose, a concept that resonated deeply with the religious fervor of the age. Their unique structure, directly accountable only to the Pope, gave them unparalleled autonomy and authority. They operated outside the traditional feudal hierarchies, meaning they weren't beholden to any single monarch or local lord. This independence allowed them to act swiftly and decisively, unencumbered by political squabbles or bureaucratic red tape. They could cross borders freely, move funds and resources without interference, and even offer protection to those who sought refuge under their banner, creating a powerful, almost sovereign entity within the Christian world. This unique position, however, would also become a source of resentment and suspicion among some secular rulers who viewed their power and independence with increasing unease. It's a bit like having a powerful, well-funded charity operating independently of any national government. Incredibly effective, but potentially a little unnerving for the powers that be. Their rules of conduct were strict, bordering on ascetic. Knights lived a communal life, slept in dormitories, ate simple meals, and were forbidden from owning personal possessions. They shaved their heads, wore humble habits when not in armor, and adhered to a strict code of silence, a far cry from the boisterous, often indulgent lives of typical medieval knights. This monastic discipline, however, translated directly into military effectiveness. It fostered brotherhood, eliminated distractions, and instilled an unwavering focus on their mission. They were, in essence, an elite special forces unit, trained not just in combat, but in spiritual devotion, believing that their cause was just and their ultimate reward divine. This spiritual foundation gave them an almost fanatical courage in battle. They were not afraid to die, believing that martyrdom in the Holy Land guaranteed a direct path to heaven. As their presence solidified, the Templars also began to take on more diplomatic and administrative roles within the Crusader states. Their vast network, their wealth, and their independent status made them invaluable intermediaries in a region constantly embroiled in political intrigue and shifting alliances. They could negotiate treaties, escort diplomatic missions, and even provide security for vital trade routes, essentially becoming an indispensable part of the fabric of Outremer society. Historians still argue whether their initial humble vow of poverty was quickly overshadowed by their immense wealth. But there's no doubt that their financial power facilitated their military objectives, allowing them to project power and maintain a constant presence where others struggled. Their wealth was a tool, a means to an end, not an end in itself, at least in their early, purer days. So while they started as humble guardians of pilgrims, the papal bull Omni Datum Optimum, issued by Pope Innocent II in 1139, was another game-changer, solidifying their special privileges and placing them even more firmly under direct papal protection. This bull essentially gave them a blank check, confirming their right to keep all spoils from battles, exemption from tithes, and even the right to build their own churches and bury their dead in consecrated ground, truly making them a church within the church. It cemented their status as a global, independent, and incredibly powerful force, ready to carve their indelible mark on the history of the Crusades and beyond, setting the stage for their immense military and financial might, which we'll explore next. With the Church's full backing, especially the incredibly powerful papal bull Omni Datum Optimum, the Knights Templar weren't just a religious order with swords. They became a military powerhouse, arguably the most effective fighting force in the Crusader states, and their strategic genius truly shone through in their fortifications. They weren't just building castles, they were crafting impregnable strongholds, architectural marvels designed to withstand sieges, project power, and protect vital territories, like the ultimate medieval security system, but for an entire region. Imagine a world where every hill and strategic pass seemed to sprout a new formidable stone behemoth, each one a testament to their dedication and, frankly, their burgeoning engineering prowess. These castles weren't just big. They were meticulously planned, often featuring multiple layers of walls, formidable towers, intricate gatehouses with murder holes, and elaborate systems for storing water and provisions, ensuring they could hold out for months, even years, against overwhelming odds. Take, for example, the legendary Château Pèlerin, or Pilgrim Castle, on the coast of present-day Israel. This wasn't just a castle. It was a fortress carved from the very rock of the coastline, designed to be supplied by sea, making it nearly impossible to starve out or isolate. The sheer audacity of its construction, facing the relentless waves and the constant threat of attack, speaks volumes about the Templars' ambition and their understanding of strategic defense. It felt less like a building and more like an extension of the land itself, a stony sentinel standing guard over the Mediterranean, watching for any sign of trouble on the horizon. Or consider Safed Castle, perched high on a hill overlooking the Sea of Galilee, a massive multi-layered complex that dominated the landscape and controlled crucial routes. These were not just defensive structures. They were statements of intent, symbols of Christian power in a contested land, and a very clear message to anyone thinking of attacking. Their military tactics were equally innovative and highly disciplined. Unlike many feudal armies of the time, which were often a chaotic mix of individual lords and their retinues, the Templars operated as a cohesive, professional unit. They were rigorously trained, disciplined, and fought with an almost fanatical zeal, believing that dying in battle for Christ was a direct ticket to heaven. This unwavering courage, coupled with their superior training, made them formidable opponents on the battlefield. They were often at the vanguard of Crusader armies, leading charges with their famous battle cry, Beauchamp, named after their black and white standard, which must have struck terror into the hearts of their enemies. Their formations were tight, their maneuvers coordinated, and their commitment to holding the line was absolute. They fought to the last man, rarely retreating, a quality that earned them both respect and fear. Historians still argue whether their military effectiveness stemmed more from their spiritual fervor or their pragmatic, modern approach to military organization and logistics. But the combination was undeniably potent. One particularly striking aspect of their military strategy was their use of heavy cavalry charges. Imagine hundreds of heavily armored knights thundering across the dusty plains, lances lowered, a white and red wave of righteous fury. This was often the decisive blow in many Crusader battles, a shock tactic designed to break enemy lines and sow panic. They were, in essence, the medieval equivalent of a tank division, an irresistible force designed to punch through any opposition. But they weren't just brute force. They were also masters of adaptation, learning from their enemies and developing counter-tactics. They understood the importance of intelligence gathering, reconnaissance, and logistical support, ensuring their forces were well supplied and informed. Beyond the grand castles, the Templars also maintained a vast network of smaller fortifications, watchtowers, and fortified hospices along pilgrimage routes, creating a protective umbrella for travelers and an early warning system against incursions. These smaller outposts were vital for maintaining control over the countryside, providing safe havens, and enabling rapid responses to threats. It was like having a vast interconnected web of security cameras and rapid response teams, ensuring that no threat went unnoticed and no pilgrim was left undefended. This intricate web of fortifications demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of strategic geography and logistics, crucial for maintaining their presence in a volatile region. Their role in the defense of the Crusader states was paramount. They were the first line of defense, often holding crucial border fortresses and engaging in skirmishes that most other forces would shy away from. They were the perennial guardians, always on alert, always ready to fight. They participated in virtually every major battle and campaign in the Holy Land, often bearing the brunt of the fighting and suffering heavy casualties. Their red crosses emblazoned on their white mantles became a symbol of unwavering commitment to the cause, a beacon of defiance against the ebb and flow of fortune in the Levant. You could almost feel the weight of their armor, the dust of the battlefield, the tension in the air as they stood ready, their very presence a shield for the fragile Crusader kingdoms. And while they were fearless warriors, they were also remarkably pragmatic. They understood that warfare wasn't just about bravery, it was about resources. Their vast wealth, often generated from their extensive European estates, was poured back into their military operations, funding the construction of these mighty castles, purchasing the best armor and weapons, and supporting a constant flow of men and material to the east. This continuous reinvestment in their military capabilities ensured they remained at the cutting edge of medieval warfare, a stark contrast to many contemporary armies that often struggled with funding and logistics. Their ability to self-finance their military endeavors made them truly unique and incredibly powerful, allowing them to operate on a scale that few secular rulers could match. This formidable combination of spiritual zeal, military discipline, and vast financial resources made the Knights Templar the veritable backbone of the Crusader states, setting the stage for their next great evolution, their transformation into an economic powerhouse. As the Knights Templar solidified their military presence, built their formidable castles, and became the indispensable shield of Outremer, an equally astonishing transformation began to take shape, one that had little to do with swords and shields, and everything to do with ledgers and letters of credit. They quietly, almost inadvertently, evolved into the Western world's first truly international banking system, a financial behemoth that managed vast sums of money for kings, popes, and ordinary pilgrims alike. It sounds almost comical, doesn't it? These warrior monks, sworn to poverty, suddenly becoming the J.P. Morgans of the Middle Ages. But it happened, and it was entirely a practical solution, born out of the desperate needs of the era. Think about it. In the 12th century, embarking on a pilgrimage or a crusade meant carrying vast sums of gold and silver across dangerous, bandit-infested territories. It was an invitation for disaster, a glittering target for any opportunistic brigand or petty lord looking to boost their coffers. People were constantly robbed, even murdered, just for the coin in their purse. So the Templars, with their extensive network of preceptories and their reputation for incorruptibility, at least initially, offered a brilliant solution. A pilgrim could deposit their wealth with a Templar house in London, Paris, or wherever they were, receive a coded receipt, and then withdraw an equivalent amount when they arrived in the Holy Land, perhaps in Acre or Jerusalem. This wasn't just a convenience, it was a revolutionary concept, essentially a precursor to modern-day travelers' checks or wire transfers. It made the perilous journey significantly safer for countless individuals, transforming their daunting pilgrimage into something slightly less terrifying, giving them at least one less thing to worry about besides dysentery and heat stroke. This system, born from a simple need, quickly expanded far beyond just pilgrims. Kings and nobles, who also needed to move large sums of money for crusades, ransoms, or diplomatic missions, quickly realized the Templars were the only ones who could do it reliably and securely. The order had preceptories, or commanderies, spread across virtually every major European kingdom and city, forming a sprawling, interconnected financial network that dwarfed any other contemporary institution. They had trained administrators, scribes, and treasurers who kept meticulous records, a far cry from the image of simple, unlettered monks. They effectively became the central bank of Europe, capable of transferring funds over vast distances with remarkable speed and efficiency for the time. Consider the complexity of this operation. Imagine managing multiple currencies, fluctuating exchange rates, and the logistical nightmare of ensuring funds were available precisely where and when they were needed, all without the aid of computers or even reliable postal services. This required an extraordinary level of trust, organization, and a sophisticated understanding of financial principles. The Templars developed intricate accounting methods, utilizing double-entry bookkeeping long before it became widespread, and they issued letters of credit that were honored across kingdoms, truly a marvel of medieval finance. Their vaults, often located within their fortified commanderies, became the safest places to store valuables in an age rife with instability and theft. People trusted the Templars with their wealth because their spiritual vows, coupled with their military might, made them practically untouchable and, crucially, reliable. Who would dare try to rob a Templar house, knowing the full wrath of the order, backed by the Pope himself, would descend upon them? It was the ultimate deterrent. Their financial services extended beyond simple deposits and transfers. They acted as moneylenders, providing loans to cash-strapped monarchs and nobles, often with security in the form of lands or jewels. They managed royal treasuries, collected taxes, and even served as financial advisors to kings, including the French monarch, who essentially used the Paris Temple as his personal bank. King Philip IV, the very king who would eventually orchestrate their downfall, was deeply indebted to them, a fact that certainly fueled his later machinations. They were also involved in property management, administering vast estates, and even acting as executors of wills, further cementing their role in the economic life of Europe. It was a dizzying array of financial activities that would make a modern investment banker blush. This immense financial power, while initially a byproduct of their military mission, soon became an end in itself for some within the order. The Templars, while individually sworn to poverty, collectively amassed staggering wealth, becoming one of the richest entities in the Christian world. Their properties included not just agricultural lands, but vineyards, mills, market stalls, and urban properties, all generating significant income. They owned entire fleets of ships, not just for transporting knights and pilgrims, but for trade, further diversifying their revenue streams and expanding their influence across the Mediterranean. They were truly global players, decades, even centuries, ahead of their time in terms of organizational scale and financial sophistication. This extraordinary financial prowess, however, also sowed the seeds of their destruction. Their immense wealth, coupled with their independence from secular rulers, generated envy and suspicion. Kings, especially those perpetually in debt, looked at the Templars' overflowing coffers with covetous eyes, seeing not a pious order, but an untapped source of funds. The very trust they had cultivated, the vast network they had built, and the immense sums they controlled, all became a tempting target for those who sought power and riches without earning them. Historians still argue whether their financial power ultimately made them too powerful, too independent, and therefore too dangerous in the eyes of insecure monarchs. But for a time, they were the undisputed financial giants. The the silent engine behind much of Europe's economic activity, and the Crusades themselves, a crucial pillar of stability in a volatile world, preparing to face the challenges of new military campaigns. So, with their immense wealth and military might firmly established, the Knights Templar were no longer just guardians of pilgrims. They were a formidable, almost indispensable force in the Crusader states, inevitably drawn into the maelstrom of larger conflicts. This brings us to the Second Crusade, a monumental undertaking launched in the mid-12th century, largely in response to the fall of the County of Edessa, one of the original Crusader states, to Muslim forces in 1144. It was a wake-up call, a stark reminder that the Christian hold on the Holy Land was tenuous, a fragile bridge over a very turbulent river. This crusade wasn't just another localized skirmish. It was a grand, ambitious endeavor, preached by none other than Bernard of Clairvaux himself, the same spiritual giant who had championed the Templars. He crisscrossed Europe, igniting religious fervor with his passionate sermons, urging kings and commoners alike to take up the cross. The campaign attracted two of Europe's most powerful monarchs, King Louis VII of France and King Conrad III of Germany. Imagine the scene: vast armies, banners unfurled, trumpets blaring, setting off from the heart of Europe, all aimed at the distant sun-scorched lands of the East. It was an undertaking of epic proportions, a true clash of civilizations, and everyone had high hopes for its success. The Templars, by this point, were a well-oiled machine, veterans of countless battles and skirmishes in the Levant. They were the natural choice to act as guides, advisors, and fighting vanguard for these incoming European armies, who frankly were often unprepared for the harsh realities of warfare in the Middle East. You see, European knights were used to temperate climates and well-watered lands. The arid, unforgiving terrain of Anatolia and Syria was a brutal shock, leading to widespread suffering, disease, and desertion. It was like sending a football team to play a match in the desert without any water bottles or sunscreen, then expecting them to win. The Templars, however, knew the terrain, understood the enemy, and had adapted their tactics to the unique challenges of the region. Their involvement in the Second Crusade was extensive, but also fraught with challenges. They served as escorts for the European kings and their armies, protecting their flanks, scouting ahead, and often leading the charge in battles. They provided vital intelligence and logistical support, using their extensive network of strongholds and supply lines to aid the struggling Crusader forces. Their discipline and experience were a stark contrast to the often disorganized and fractious European armies, who, despite their numbers, suffered immensely from internal divisions, poor leadership, and a complete lack of understanding of the local conditions. One of the most telling episodes of the Second Crusade, and a major lesson for the Templars, was the disastrous march through Anatolia. The German army, under King Conrad III, was virtually annihilated by the Seljuk Turks near Dorylaeum in 1147, largely due to poor planning and a catastrophic lack of supplies. The French army, under Louis VII, fared only slightly better, constantly harried and ambushed. The Templars, acting as the rearguard, often found themselves fighting desperate rearguard actions, saving what remained of the Crusader forces from complete annihilation. They essentially became the mop-up crew, doing their best to salvage a terrible situation, which must have been incredibly frustrating. The ultimate failure of the Second Crusade, however, wasn't just about military blunders. It highlighted a fundamental disconnect between the European monarchs' grand designs and the gritty realities on the ground in Outremer. The European leaders arrived with their own agendas, often clashing with the established Crusader nobility, and their decisions were often based on incomplete information or outright folly. The most infamous example of this folly was the decision to besiege Damascus in 1148. Damascus was, at the time, a crucial Muslim ally against Nur ad-Din, the powerful ruler of Aleppo and Mosul, and attacking it made absolutely no strategic sense. It was a classic example of snatching defeat from the jaws of, well, not victory, but at least a stable, mutually beneficial status quo. The siege of Damascus was a complete debacle. The Templars initially advised against it, understanding the complex political landscape, but were ultimately overruled. They participated in the siege, fighting valiantly, but the lack of coordination among the Crusader forces, combined with the strong resistance from the Damascenes and the arrival of Nur ad-Din's relief force, led to a humiliating retreat after only 4 days. It was an unmitigated disaster, not only failing to achieve its objective, but also alienating a potential ally and strengthening Nur ad-Din's position. This episode taught the Templars a harsh lesson. Even with their prowess, they couldn't always compensate for poor leadership and strategic miscalculations from their European allies. Historians still argue whether the Templars, with their intimate knowledge of the region, could have truly swayed the powerful monarchs, or if their advice was simply destined to be ignored. The lasting impact of the Second Crusade on the Templars was profound. It underscored the vital importance of local knowledge and disciplined, professional forces like their own. It also showed them the inherent unreliability of large-scale European crusades, which often arrived with much fanfare but little understanding, and often left behind a trail of destruction and weakened Crusader states. From then on, the Templars increasingly relied on their own resources and expertise, rather than putting all their eggs in the basket of a new, well-intentioned, but often incompetent European expedition. They understood that the defense of Outremer rested primarily on their shoulders, and those of the other military orders and the local nobility, not on the fickle fortunes of distant European monarchs. This hard-won experience would be crucial in the coming decades, as they faced an even greater threat in the form of a unified Muslim power rising in the East. The failures of the Second Crusade, though a bitter pill to swallow, served as a grim foreshadowing of the colossal challenge that would soon emerge from the East: the rise of Saladin. If the earlier Muslim adversaries were fragmented and often at odds with each other, Saladin was different. He was a strategic genius, a charismatic leader, and a master of unification, slowly but inexorably forging the various Muslim factions of Egypt and Syria into a singular, formidable power. Imagine the Crusader states, scattered like chess pieces on a board, suddenly facing a player who was not only brilliant, but also had an increasingly unified, powerful army at his command. It was a ticking time bomb, and the Templars, with their intimate knowledge of the region, could almost certainly hear the clock ticking louder than anyone else. Saladin, whose full name was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, was a Kurdish Muslim who initially served under Nur ad-Din, the very ruler who had benefited from the disastrous Second Crusade siege of Damascus. But after Nur ad-Din's death, Saladin swiftly consolidated his control, first over Egypt, then Syria, forging an empire that completely encircled the beleaguered Crusader states. He wasn't just a conqueror. He was a skilled diplomat, a savvy politician, and a devout Muslim who saw the expulsion of the Crusaders as his holy destiny, a calling that resonated deeply with his followers. His rise was a slow, deliberate tightening of the noose around Outremer, and the Templars, always at the front lines, were acutely aware of the growing danger. The tension between Saladin's burgeoning empire and the Crusader states escalated through a series of skirmishes, broken truces, and diplomatic maneuvers that felt like a perpetually unpopped popcorn kernel, just waiting for the explosive pop. The Templars, true to their mandate, were often at the forefront of these clashes, engaging Saladin's forces in pitched battles and defensive sieges. They were known for their relentless pursuit of enemies and their refusal to surrender, often fighting to the last man, a terrifying reputation for their foes, and a comforting thought for their allies, even if it meant staggering losses for the order. The inevitable confrontation came to a head with the fateful Battle of Hattin in July 1187. This was not just a battle. It was an unmitigated catastrophe for the Crusader forces, a day of unimaginable horror and a turning point that would forever alter the course of the Crusades. The immediate trigger was a particularly audacious raid by Reynold of Châtillon, a volatile Crusader lord and an old enemy of Saladin's, who attacked a Muslim caravan during a truce, even capturing Saladin's sister. This act of blatant provocation, despite the Templars' general adherence to treaties, though they were not entirely without fault themselves, ignited Saladin's righteous fury and provided the pretext for his massive invasion. The Crusader army, led by King Guy of Lusignan, along with the Master of the Templars, Gerard de Riedefort, and the Master of the Hospitallers, assembled to confront Saladin's forces. However, their strategic decisions were disastrous. Against the advice of more seasoned commanders, they chose to march across the arid, waterless plains of Galilee in the searing July heat to relieve the besieged stronghold of Tiberias. This was a tactical blunder of epic proportions, a truly baffling decision that played directly into Saladin's hands, like deciding to run a marathon in a desert without any water, just for fun. The Christian army, already exhausted and parched, was lured into a trap near the horns of Hattin, two prominent hills with a crucial water source nearby, the springs of Kafr Hattin. Saladin's forces expertly cut off their access to water, surrounding them on all sides. What followed was a massacre. The Templars, along with the Knights Hospitaller, formed the backbone of the Crusader army, fighting with their characteristic bravery and desperation. They launched repeated, valiant charges, attempting to break through the Muslim lines and reach water. But each attempt was repulsed. The Muslim archers rained down arrows. The heat was unbearable, and thirst became an agonizing torment. The Templars fought until they could fight no more. Many were killed on the battlefield, others captured. Saladin, recognizing the Templars and Hospitallers as the most implacable and dangerous of his foes, ordered the execution of almost all the captured Templar and Hospitaller knights, sparing only a select few for ransom. This brutal act was a testament to the fear and respect he held for these warrior monks. Acknowledging their unwavering commitment to their cause, the holy relic of the true cross, carried into battle as a source of inspiration, was also captured, a devastating blow to Christian morale. It was a dark day, painted crimson with the blood of thousands, a profound loss that shook the very foundations of the Crusader states. The immediate aftermath of Hattin was catastrophic. With the flower of the Crusader knighthood decimated, and many castles stripped of their garrisons to form the doomed field army, Saladin swept through the Crusader states, taking city after city with astonishing speed. The path to Jerusalem lay open, virtually undefended. This was the moment Saladin had waited for, the culmination of his life's work, and the Templars, having suffered immense losses, could do little to stop him. The fall of Jerusalem, just a few months later, in October 1187, was the inevitable consequence of Hattin. Saladin, to his credit, allowed the Christian inhabitants to leave peacefully, a stark contrast to the brutal massacre that had occurred when the first Crusaders captured the city. It was a moment of profound spiritual and political defeat for Christendom, an echo that reverberated across Europe, setting the stage for the next great Crusader effort, the one that would attempt to reclaim what was so tragically lost. The devastating loss at the Battle of Hattin and the subsequent fall of Jerusalem in 1187 sent shockwaves across Europe, igniting a fervent desire for revenge and reclamation, paving the way for the Third Crusade. Imagine the collective gasp of horror, the outrage, the calls for holy vengeance echoing from every pulpit and castle hall. It was a crisis of monumental proportions for Christendom, a spiritual and political blow that demanded an immediate, overwhelming response. This wasn't just about reclaiming territory. It was about restoring Christian pride and honor, about setting right what had gone so terribly wrong. This crusade was different. Unlike previous expeditions, it attracted the most powerful monarchs of Europe, a veritable who's who of medieval royalty, eager to prove their piety and secure their legacy. We're talking about Friedrich the Fawn Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, Philip II Augustus, the King of France, and perhaps most famously, Richard the Bum, the Lionheart, King of England. It was like assembling a medieval supergroup, each with their own distinct personality and agenda, but united, at least in theory, by the common goal of retaking Jerusalem. This time, surely, with such formidable leadership, success was guaranteed, right? Well, history, as it often does, had other plans, reminding us that even the most impressive lineups can hit a few sour notes. The Knights Templar, despite having been decimated at Hattin, losing hundreds of their finest knights, and their Grand Master Gerard de Riedefort, were still very much alive and kicking, though perhaps a little less vigorously. They quickly regrouped, drawing upon their vast resources and extensive network of commanderies across Europe to replenish their ranks and rebuild their strength. They were, in essence, the hardened veterans who knew the battlefield intimately, scarred but unbowed. Their experience and knowledge of the Holy Land were invaluable, making them indispensable guides and military advisors to the arriving European armies, who, bless their hearts, still had a steep learning curve ahead of them regarding warfare in the Levant. Their role in the Third Crusade was pivotal, though often complicated by the strong personalities of the three kings. They were at the forefront of the sieges, battles, and negotiations. Their distinctive white mantles with the red cross, a common sight amidst the chaos of war. They acted as a core, disciplined fighting force, filling the gaps where royal armies faltered, and lending their experience to strategic planning. They were always there, always fighting, from the initial grinding siege of Acre to the various skirmishes and diplomatic standoffs that followed. The Siege of Acre, which lasted from 1189 to 1191, was a truly monumental undertaking, a prolonged, brutal struggle that consumed years and countless lives. It was less a siege and more a continuous sprawling battle, a medieval meat grinder that pitted Crusader forces, including the newly arrived European armies, against Saladin's determined defenders. The Templars played a crucial role throughout, often manning key sections of the siege lines, launching desperate assaults on the city walls, and defending against Saladin's relief efforts. Imagine the constant din of trebuchets, the shouts of battle, the stench of death, and the grinding frustration of a siege that seemed to go on forever. It was a test of endurance, willpower, and sheer stubbornness, and the Templars were nothing if not stubborn. Their relationship with Richard the Lionheart was particularly fascinating and complex. Richard, a brilliant military commander, recognized the Templars' tactical prowess and often relied on them as his elite shock troops. They fought bravely under his command, particularly at the Battle of Arsuf in 1191, where Richard inflicted a significant defeat on Saladin. The Templars formed the vanguard of Richard's army, launching a decisive charge that broke Saladin's lines, proving their continued effectiveness on the battlefield. Richard even used the Templars as his personal treasury and bankers during the crusade, entrusting them with his royal funds, a testament to their financial reliability and trustworthiness, a fact that surely stung when considering their later fate. However, their relationship wasn't always smooth sailing. Richard, for all his military genius, was famously impetuous, and the Templars, with their own strategic agenda and a deep understanding of the Holy Land's political intricacies, sometimes found themselves at odds with his grand schemes. There were disagreements over tactics, objectives, and the delicate balance of power among the various Crusader factions. While Richard might have seen the Templars as a powerful tool, the Templars viewed themselves as an independent force with a sacred mission, not merely pawns in a king's game. This underlying tension, a subtle dance between cooperation and independence, would characterize many of their dealings with secular rulers. Despite their heroic efforts and Richard's military brilliance, the Third Crusade ultimately failed to retake Jerusalem. While it achieved significant victories, notably the capture of Acre and the re-establishment of a coastal Crusader kingdom centered around it, a combination of factors, including the exhaustion of the Crusader forces, internal disputes among the kings, and Saladin's resilient defense, prevented them from reaching their ultimate goal. Richard eventually negotiated a truce with Saladin, allowing Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem, but leaving the city under Muslim control. This outcome was a bitter disappointment for the Templars, who had dedicated their lives to the city's protection and reclamation. It was a stark reminder that even with the combined might of Europe's greatest monarchs, the Holy Land remained a stubbornly difficult prize to grasp. The long drawn-out conflict, the constant attrition, and the strategic compromises would force the Templars to rethink their approach, setting the stage for a period of consolidation in their remaining strongholds in Outremer, with the Third Crusade concluding not with the triumphant retaking of Jerusalem, but with a negotiated truce. A sense of weary realism settled over the remaining Crusader states, and by extension, the Knights Templar. The dream of a fully Christian-controlled Holy Land seemed more distant than ever, and the Order, having poured immense blood and treasure into the conflict, had to pivot from grand conquests to the gritty, often frustrating work of consolidation in Outremer. This wasn't about glorious charges and decisive battles anymore. It was about holding what little ground they had left, a desperate game of strategic chess played on a rapidly shrinking board. Imagine the atmosphere, a persistent hum of anxiety, a feeling of being constantly on edge, like living in a perpetual state of amber alert. The coastal strip, now significantly reduced, stretched precariously along the Mediterranean, with cities like Acre, Tyre, and Sidon serving as the last bastions of Latin Christian presence. The Templars, along with the Hospitallers and the Teutonic Knights, who had emerged as another significant military order during the Third Crusade, became the primary defenders of these fragile enclaves, the last line of defense against a resurgent Muslim power under the Ayyubids, Saladin's successors. They were, in essence, the permanent security detail for a very vulnerable VIP, constantly scanning the horizon for trouble. Their strategy shifted from offensive operations to defensive resilience. The emphasis was now on strengthening existing fortifications, building new, smaller castles to guard key passes and strategic points, and maintaining a constant state of readiness. They became masters of siege warfare, not just on the offensive, but more crucially, in defense, holding out against overwhelming odds for months, sometimes years, within their formidable walls. Think of them as the ultimate endurance athletes of medieval warfare, designed for sustained pressure and relentless defense. The very landscape of Outremer became dotted with their fortified garrisons, each a lonely outpost of Christian defiance against the tides of change. The internal politics of the Crusader states during this period were, to put it mildly, a complete mess. Imagine a family dinner where everyone has a different idea of what to order, and half the family isn't even speaking to the other half. The Latin nobility, weakened by constant warfare and internal feuds, often squabbled amongst themselves, undermining any semblance of a unified front. The arrival of fresh crusades from Europe, while offering temporary relief, often brought new leaders with their own agendas, leading to further divisions and strategic blunders. The Templars, with their disciplined structure and independent command, often found themselves caught in the middle of these internecine conflicts, trying to steer a coherent course amidst a sea of petty rivalries and conflicting ambitions. They also continued their vital role as protectors of pilgrims and facilitators of trade. Even with Jerusalem in Muslim hands, Christian pilgrims still flocked to the Holy Land, eager to visit sacred sites that were now accessible under truce agreements. The Templars, with their secure routes and strongholds, provided essential escort services, ensuring that these devout travelers could fulfill their spiritual vows without falling prey to bandits or hostile forces. Their ships continued to ply the Mediterranean, transporting goods and people, maintaining vital economic links with Europe, and generating crucial revenue for the order, demonstrating their continued importance to the economic as well as military fabric of Outremer. One of the less glamorous but equally important aspects of their consolidation efforts was diplomacy. The Templars, through necessity and long experience, developed a sophisticated understanding of the complex web of alliances and rivalries among the various Muslim rulers. They often acted as intermediaries, negotiating truces, prisoner exchanges, and trade agreements with local emirs, sometimes even forming temporary alliances of convenience against common enemies. This required a pragmatic approach, often putting strategic necessity above ideological purity, a subtle dance that sometimes drew criticism from more zealous elements within Christendom. They were, in a way, the original realpolitik practitioners, understanding that survival in the Levant meant making difficult choices and sometimes dealing with the devil you knew. Historians still argue whether the Templars, during this period, became too entangled in the political machinations of Outremer, losing some of their initial spiritual purity in the process. Certainly, the constant pressure, the endless cycle of warfare and negotiation, and the sheer burden of defending a perpetually threatened frontier must have taken their toll. Their vast wealth, while indispensable for their operations, also made them targets of envy and suspicion, both from their Christian allies and their Muslim adversaries. It's almost like everyone wanted a piece of the Templar pie, or at least to know what secret ingredient made it so powerful. The Templars faced not just external enemies, but also the internal challenge of maintaining morale and discipline amidst a seemingly endless war of attrition. They were constantly recruiting, training new knights, and reinforcing their garrisons, a never-ending cycle of maintaining strength against overwhelming odds. The white mantle with the red cross remained a symbol of hope and resistance, but the men beneath it carried the heavy weight of a sacred trust, constantly aware that the survival of the Latin East rested heavily on their shoulders. As the 13th century unfolded, the situation in Outremer grew increasingly desperate. New crusades from Europe were launched, often with grand ambitions, but ultimately achieving little, a repeating cycle of hope and disappointment. The 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th crusades all came and went, each leaving behind a slightly weaker, more vulnerable crusader presence. The Templars, through it all, remained steadfast in their commitment, but steadily depleted by constant warfare and dwindling support from a Europe that was increasingly preoccupied with its own affairs. The shadow of their ultimate demise began to lengthen, though few could have foreseen the dramatic and brutal way it would unfold, far from the battlefields of the Holy Land. As the 13th century wore on, the Knights Templar, despite their unwavering commitment to defending the shrinking Crusader states, found themselves caught in an increasingly tangled web of internal tensions and rivalries, not just with external enemies, but with their supposed allies. Imagine being on the front lines, fighting tooth and nail against a common foe, only to find yourself constantly looking over your shoulder at those who are supposed to be standing beside you. It was a recipe for disaster, a slow-burning fire that chipped away at the cohesion of the Christian presence in Outremer, making their already precarious position even more untenable. The most prominent and often bitter rivalry was with their spiritual cousins, the Knights Hospitaller of St. John, another powerful military order dedicated to similar goals. While both orders were ostensibly fighting for Christendom, their relationship was more often characterized by intense competition than by harmonious cooperation. Think of them as two highly successful, but fiercely competitive, corporate rivals, both vying for market share. Only their market share was strategic castles, military recruits, and donations from pious European nobles. They competed for land, for influence, for the custody of important relics, and even for the right to escort particular groups of pilgrims. It was a rivalry that often escalated into open conflict, with knights of one order sometimes ambushing or even fighting those of the other. A truly bewildering spectacle to behold when the Muslim enemy was literally at their gates. This rivalry wasn't just about pride. It had tangible consequences on the battlefield. There were instances where one order would refuse to reinforce the other's positions, or where strategic opportunities were missed because of a lack of coordination and mutual suspicion. Imagine the sheer frustration of a commander seeing an opening, only to realize that the necessary support from a neighboring allied unit isn't coming because of some petty grudge. Historians still argue whether the Templar-Hospitaller rivalry was a fatal flaw for the Crusader states, or merely a symptom of the deeper inherent divisions within the Latin East. But undeniably, it weakened the overall Christian military capacity and presented opportunities for their enemies to exploit. Beyond the Hospitallers, the Templars also faced growing friction with the various secular lords and princes of the Crusader states. Remember their unique status, directly accountable only to the Pope? This independence, which had been such a boon in their early days, became a source of resentment. Local rulers, struggling to assert their authority and manage their meager resources, viewed the Templars' immense wealth, vast landholdings, and autonomous power with a mixture of envy and suspicion. They resented the Templars' exemption from taxes, their ability to recruit freely, and their often unwillingness to bow to local political whims. It was like having a powerful, independent nation-state operating within your own borders, immune to your laws and richer than you, a situation ripe for friction. There were frequent disputes over jurisdiction, property rights, and military strategy. A Templar Grand Master might refuse a secular lord's command if he believed it was strategically unsound or contrary to the order's interests, leading to bitter arguments and sometimes open defiance. This was particularly true as the Crusader states became more isolated and desperate. Everyone was under immense pressure, and tempers flared easily. The Templars' reputation for strict discipline and unyielding adherence to their own rules, while admirable in many respects, sometimes made them appear inflexible and arrogant to those outside their ranks. Furthermore, tensions occasionally arose even within the Templar order itself, especially as its size and influence grew. While the rule of the order was strict, human nature being what it is, not every knight was a saint. There were instances of corruption, of individual knights straying from their vows, and of internal power struggles among different factions or national groups within the order. While these were generally exceptions rather than the rule, and the Templars maintained a high standard of discipline, such incidents provided fodder for rumors and criticism from their detractors, who were always eager to find fault with the immensely powerful order. The increasing insularity of the military orders also played a role. Over time, the Templars and Hospitallers became almost states within a state, their loyalties often more aligned with their respective orders than with the fluctuating fortunes of the individual Crusader kingdoms or the interests of transient European crusades. They became the perpetual residents, the long-term stakeholders, whereas many European nobles came and went. This long-term perspective was often crucial for survival in the Levant, but it also meant they developed their own agenda, which sometimes diverged from the immediate political goals of secular rulers. This constant internal friction, coupled with the relentless pressure from external enemies, created a corrosive environment that slowly but surely undermined the effectiveness of the Crusader presence. Instead of a united Christian front, there was often a fragmented, squabbling collection of factions, each pursuing its own interests, often at the expense of the collective good. Historians still argue whether this internal strife was a primary cause of the Crusader state's eventual downfall, or simply an inevitable consequence of prolonged warfare and geographical isolation. But there's no denying that it made the Templars' job, already impossibly difficult, even harder. The seeds of discord, once sown, began to grow, setting the stage for even greater political maneuverings in Europe that would ultimately determine the Templars' grim fate, far from the sun-drenched battlefields of Outremer. As the Crusader states teetered on the brink in Outremer, often weakened by their own internal squabbles and the relentless pressure from Muslim forces, the Knights Templar found themselves increasingly embroiled in the intricate and often treacherous world of politics, popes, and power in Europe. It was a dizzying dance of allegiances, debts, and shifting ambitions that played out across the continent, far from the dusty battlefields of the Holy Land. Remember that unique status they had, directly accountable only to the Pope? While it granted them immense autonomy and power, it also meant they were a force unto themselves, a kind of independent principality with their own foreign policy, beholden to no king. And this, as you can imagine, rubbed many monarchs the wrong way. Their vast financial network, which had been such an asset for facilitating crusades and managing pilgrim funds, now made them indispensable, yet simultaneously dangerous to European monarchs. Kings, perpetually short on cash for their wars and lavish courts, increasingly turned to the Templars as their bankers. They borrowed heavily, often against future tax revenues or crown lands, putting them deeply in debt to the order. King Louis IX of France, a truly pious monarch and a major patron of the Crusades, frequently used the Templars as his treasury and financial agents. He trusted them implicitly, knowing their integrity and efficiency were unparalleled. But even for a saintly king, such reliance on an independent, immensely wealthy entity could breed a subtle undercurrent of resentment. It's like owing your rich aunt a fortune. You appreciate the help, but also wish you didn't need it quite so much. The Templars' direct relationship with the Pope was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it provided them with unparalleled authority and protection, placing them above the jurisdiction of local bishops and secular rulers. They could levy taxes on their own lands, collect tithes, and even maintain their own chapels and cemeteries, privileges that were fiercely guarded and often resented by the local clergy. Papal bulls confirmed their special status, allowing them to operate as a self-governing entity within the broader fabric of Christendom. This was incredibly powerful, effectively making them a sovereign entity accountable only to the highest spiritual authority. On the other hand, this close relationship meant they were deeply intertwined with the often turbulent politics of the papacy itself. Popes came and went, each with their own agendas, alliances, and feuds. The Templars, as papal instruments, sometimes found themselves caught in the crossfire of these broader ecclesiastical and political struggles. They were expected to be loyal to the sitting pope, but their operational necessities in the East sometimes clashed with papal decrees issued from afar, leading to awkward situations and difficult choices. Their influence extended far beyond mere finance. They became influential advisors to kings and popes, their grand masters often present at major councils and royal courts, offering their unique perspective on affairs in the East and their military expertise. They were, in a sense, the medieval equivalent of a think tank combined with a private security firm, providing both strategic advice and boots on the ground. Their political savvy was honed by decades of dealing with complex multicultural dynamics in Outremer, making them shrewd negotiators and diplomats in the intricate game of European power politics. However, as the 13th century progressed and the Crusader states grew increasingly desperate, the European focus began to shift. The initial fervor for crusading waned, replaced by internal European conflicts, dynastic struggles, and the burgeoning power of national monarchies. Kings like Philip IV of France, who would play a central role in the Templars' downfall, were less interested in abstract notions of holy war and more concerned with consolidating their own power, centralizing control, and filling their royal treasuries. To such monarchs, the Templars, with their immense wealth, their independent status, and their sprawling international network, looked less like pious crusaders and more like an inconvenient, immensely rich state within a state, a potential rival for power and a tantalizing source of untapped funds. The Templars' commitment to the Holy Land also meant they often resisted calls to use their resources for European conflicts, further annoying monarchs who saw their wealth as a national asset. When Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold, was gravely threatened, the Templars were focused on its defense, while European kings were busy fighting each other. This created a growing disconnect between the Order's primary mission and the shifting priorities of their European patrons, a slow-motion unraveling of alliances that would prove fatal. This period saw the Templars at the zenith of their power and influence in Europe, yet also at their most vulnerable. Their very success, their wealth, and their independence became a target. The Whisper campaign against them, which would later explode into full-blown accusations, began to gather momentum. People, especially those who resented their power or owed them money, started to look for reasons to dislike them. Tales of their secret rights, their immense wealth, and their perceived arrogance began to circulate, fueled by envy and fear. Historians still argue whether these early whispers were just standard medieval gossip or part of a more concerted early campaign to undermine them. But as the Crusader dream faded, and the Templars' utility as defenders of Outremer seemed less pressing to European rulers, their immense wealth and unique status made them an increasingly attractive target for those seeking to consolidate their own power and fill their empty coffers, setting the stage for the dramatic, violent end of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. The final agonizing chapters of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land culminated in the tragic loss of Acre in 1291, an event that effectively marked the end of Christian rule in Outremer and forced the Knights Templar, along with the other military orders, to face a grim new reality. They no longer had a permanent base in the land they had sworn to defend. Imagine being a seasoned warrior, your entire purpose defined by defending a specific place, only for that place to fall, leaving you adrift, your very identity seemingly dissolving with the last crumbling stones of the city walls. It was a shattering defeat, not just geographically, but spiritually and psychologically, for those who had dedicated their lives to the cause. Acre, known as the key to Palestine, was the last major Crusader stronghold, a bustling port city and the effective capital of the remnant Latin kingdom of Jerusalem. It was a melting pot of cultures, a hub of trade, and a place where European pilgrims and merchants rubbed shoulders with seasoned warriors and diplomatic envoys. But it was also a city under constant threat, a bastion surrounded by a sea of increasingly unified and powerful Mamluk forces from Egypt, led by the formidable Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil. The Mamluks, remember, were a powerful, highly disciplined military class themselves, who had by this point completely eclipsed the Ayyubids, Saladin's dynasty, and were determined to expel the last vestiges of Crusader presence. The siege of Acre in 1291 was a brutal, drawn-out affair, a grinding war of attrition that showcased the desperate courage of the defenders and the overwhelming might of the Mamluk attackers. The Mamluk army was enormous, fielding tens of thousands of soldiers, a vast array of siege engines, and a seemingly endless supply of resources. The defenders, a motley collection of Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights, local levies, and a few thousand European Crusaders who had answered the desperate call for aid, were vastly outnumbered. It was a truly unequal struggle, like watching a determined but tiny ant colony try to defend against a rampaging elephant. The Templars, under their Grand Master Guillaume de Beaujeu, fought with their legendary ferocity, leading desperate sorties, defending breaches in the walls, and sustaining horrific casualties. They were the heart and soul of the defense, their white mantles with the red cross visible amidst the carnage, inspiring others to fight to the last. The fighting was hand-to-hand, brutal, and relentless. Mamluk miners painstakingly dug tunnels beneath the walls, collapsing sections and creating breaches through which their overwhelming forces poured. Each breach became a scene of desperate, bloody resistance, with Templars and Hospitallers throwing themselves into the fray, often to their last breath, trying to stem the tide. One particularly poignant detail, perhaps a little morbid for bedtime, but historically crucial, is that the Mamluks specifically targeted the main gate of the Templar quarter, knowing that if they could break through there, the city would fall. And break through they did. When the city's outer walls were finally breached, the surviving Templars retreated to their formidable fortress within Acre, a massive, heavily fortified complex that stood as a last bastion. This was their ultimate redoubt, a final, desperate stand. For days, the Templar fortress held out, even as the rest of Acre fell into Mamluk hands. The Mamluks, furious at their stubborn resistance, offered terms of surrender, promising safe passage for the remaining Templars and civilians sheltering within. However, when a group of Mamluk soldiers entered the fortress, they began to molest the women and children, a heinous act that shattered any pretense of honorable surrender. The Templars, enraged, responded with righteous fury, driving the Mamluks out and securing the gates, essentially choosing to fight to the death rather than allow such atrocities. The Mamluk Sultan, infuriated by this defiance, ordered a final, overwhelming assault. The Templar fortress, riddled with tunnels from the Mamluk sappers, eventually collapsed under the weight of the continuous assaults and the undermining of its foundations, burying many of the last defenders beneath its rubble. The few who survived the collapse, including the last remnant of the Templar garrison, were either killed or captured. Grand Master Guillaume de Beaujeu himself was mortally wounded during the final desperate fighting, a grim symbol of the end of an era. The fall of Acre was a bloody, decisive defeat, extinguishing the flickering flame of the Crusader states after nearly 2 centuries. With the loss of Acre, the Templars, along with the Hospitallers, retreated to their remaining island strongholds in the Mediterranean, primarily Cyprus. This was not a strategic retreat. It was an evacuation, a desperate scramble to salvage what they could from the wreckage of their centuries-long presence in the Holy Land. Their mission, once so clear, the defense of Jerusalem and pilgrims, was now in question. What was a military order dedicated to the Holy Land to do when there was no Holy Land left to defend? This existential crisis, combined with their immense wealth and their continued independence, made them a truly tempting target, ripe for exploitation by ambitious monarchs. Historians still argue about the exact number of Templars who perished at Acre, but the consensus is that it was a devastating blow to the order's strength and morale. Their return to Europe, or rather, their relocation to Cyprus, was not a triumphant homecoming, but a forced exile. They were powerful, wealthy, and still independent, but they no longer served their original purpose. This lingering power, combined with their increasingly uncertain future, would attract the covetous gaze of a king desperate for funds, leading directly to the dramatic events that would unfold less than 2 decades later, proving that sometimes the biggest threats come not from distant battlefields, but from within your own continent. The fall of Acre in 1291 was not just a military defeat. It was an existential crisis for the Knights Templar. Imagine spending 2 centuries defining your entire existence around a specific geographical mission, defending the Holy Land, only for that land to be lost. Suddenly, the very foundation of their identity crumbled, leaving them powerful, wealthy, but seemingly without a clear, immediate purpose. This forced return to Europe and the struggle for a new purpose was arguably as challenging as any battle they had ever fought. A silent war of relevance and survival. Initially, the Templars, along with the Hospitallers, relocated their main headquarters to the island of Cyprus. This made strategic sense. It was a Christian island stronghold, relatively close to the Levant, and allowed them to maintain a forward base should another crusade be launched. They continued to operate their vast financial network from there, and their fleets still controlled much of the Mediterranean trade, effectively becoming a major maritime power. They didn't just pack up their bags and head home like a defeated army. They tried to adapt, maintaining their military readiness and hoping for a chance to reclaim their lost territories. They even launched small localized expeditions and raids against the Mamluks from Cyprus, a testament to their enduring, if forlorn, hope. However, the political and religious landscape of Europe had shifted dramatically since the heyday of the First and Second Crusades. The initial fervor had largely cooled, replaced by internal European conflicts, the rise of powerful national monarchies, and a growing skepticism towards the efficacy and cost of further crusades. Kings were more concerned with consolidating their own power and filling their coffers than with distant holy wars. The idea of a massive multinational expedition to retake Jerusalem, once a rallying cry, now seemed like a relic of a bygone era, an expensive fantasy. This change in European priorities presented a fundamental challenge to the Templars. what was a wealthy, independent military order whose primary raison d'etre had vanished supposed to do? They still maintained vast estates and commanderies across Europe, generating immense income and housing thousands of knights, sergeants, and chaplains. But without a clear, compelling external threat in the East to focus their formidable energies, their very existence began to be questioned. It's a bit like a highly specialized, incredibly effective fire department whose city suddenly becomes fireproof. What do they do with all their equipment and trained personnel? Various proposals for a new crusade or a unified military order were floated, discussed, and ultimately discarded. Some suggested merging the Templars and Hospitallers into a single, more powerful entity, hoping that a unified front might overcome the debilitating rivalries that had plagued them in the East. But neither order was keen on surrendering its independence, its unique history, or its vast assets to the other. Imagine trying to merge two fiercely independent, multi-billion-dollar corporations, each with its own culture and leadership. It was a non-starter. Both Grand Masters, Jacques de Molay for the Templars and Foulques de Villeret for the Hospitallers, resisted such proposals, fiercely protecting their order's autonomy. The Templars also attempted to redefine their role. They continued their banking activities, which remained incredibly profitable and essential for European commerce. They continued to manage their vast agricultural estates, contributing significantly to local economies. Some scholars even suggest they engaged in more esoteric pursuits, preserving knowledge or developing advanced technologies, though such claims lean heavily into the realm of legend rather than documented fact. But none of these activities, however practical or profitable, could fully replace the moral authority and prestige derived from being the direct defenders of Christ's tomb. This period of uncertainty and re-evaluation made them increasingly vulnerable. Their immense wealth, once a source of strength, now made them a tantalizing target. Their independence, once protected by papal authority and a clear mission, now seemed like an anomaly, an affront to the burgeoning power of centralized monarchies. Kings, especially those burdened by debt and eager to consolidate power, began to cast covetous eyes on the Templars' assets. Why should this immensely rich, independent order exist when its original purpose was gone? And when their own royal treasuries were empty? Whispers, which had always circulated about the Templars' secretive rights and immense power, now grew louder and more ominous. When a group of powerful men operates with such secrecy and possesses such wealth, suspicion naturally arises, especially in an era prone to superstition and conspiracy theories. Stories about strange initiation rituals, hidden treasures, and even accusations of heresy began to circulate, often fueled by their rivals or those who wished them ill. Historians still debate whether these rumors were genuine concerns or deliberately fabricated to create a pretext for their downfall. But regardless of their origin, these whispers laid the groundwork for the devastating accusations that would soon be leveled against them. The Templars, perhaps too confident in their papal protection and their long history of service to Christendom, seemed largely oblivious to the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. They believed their unparalleled sacrifices in the Holy Land and their unwavering loyalty to the Church would protect them from any serious threat. They had survived centuries of warfare, political intrigue, and internal rivalries. Surely, They could weather this period of readjustment. They couldn't have known that the most dangerous enemy they would ever face would not be a Mamluk sultan on a distant battlefield, but a Christian king in the heart of Europe, whose machinations would prove far more insidious and ultimately fatal than any military defeat. Their very existence, once a beacon of crusader zeal, was about to become a liability, setting the stage for one of history's most shocking acts of state-sponsored persecution. As the Knights Templar found themselves navigating the uncertain waters of post-Outremer Europe, seeking a new direction, the air around them began to thicken with an insidious fog of rumors and whispers. Imagine trying to rebrand yourself, to find your place in a rapidly changing world, all while a growing chorus of shadowy voices spreads unsettling tales about your past, your practices, and your immense wealth. This wasn't just idle gossip. It was a slow, deliberate poisoning of public opinion, a subtle but effective campaign that would lay the groundwork for their catastrophic fall. These weren't new whispers, mind you. Even in their heyday, the Templars, with their secretive initiation rites, their monastic discipline, and their independent status, had always been subjects of fascination and speculation. People loved a good mystery, and an order of warrior monks who seemed to operate outside the normal rules of society and who possessed astonishing wealth was ripe for fantastical tales. Stories about hidden treasures, arcane knowledge, and strange ceremonies had always circulated, often fueled by awe and curiosity rather than malice. But after the fall of Acre, with their primary mission seemingly gone, and their wealth still very much present, these whispers took on a far more sinister tone. The first, and perhaps most damaging, set of rumors revolved around their alleged apostasy and blasphemy. In medieval Europe, where faith was the bedrock of society, any hint of deviation from orthodox Christian belief was a capital offense. Literally, whispers began to spread that during their initiation ceremonies, new Templar recruits were forced to deny Christ, spit on the cross, or even engage in indecent acts. It sounds utterly preposterous to us now, like something out of a bad movie. But remember the context. A deeply religious society that was prone to believing in devils, witches, and secret conspiracies. These rumors played directly into people's deepest fears and anxieties about heresy and the subversion of sacred values. Then there were the accusations of idol worship. It was rumored they worshipped a strange, bearded head, sometimes called Baphomet. The name itself sounds mysterious and foreign, doesn't it? Like something conjured from the darkest corners of a medieval imagination. This could have stemmed from misinterpretations of their veneration of relics, or perhaps from crude misrepresentations of certain religious artifacts they might have possessed. But in the hands of malicious gossip mongers, it transformed into a terrifying tale of satanic worship, a direct challenge to the very essence of Christian devotion. Their immense wealth, which we discussed earlier, was another powerful magnet for suspicion. In a world where poverty was often seen as a virtue, and where the Church preached renunciation of the worldly goods, the Templars' vast riches seemed almost scandalous. How could an order sworn to poverty accumulate such staggering fortunes? Surely, it must be through illicit means, or worse, through some unholy pact. This resentment, particularly from nobles and commoners alike who struggled with poverty, was fertile ground for accusations of avarice, usury, and a general abandonment of their spiritual vows. It fueled the perception that they were no longer pious warrior monks, but greedy bankers cloaked in sacred robes. Their secrecy, once a practical necessity for a military order operating in a hostile land, now became a liability. Because their internal affairs were largely hidden from public view, and because their command structure was so centralized and independent, it was easy for critics to imagine all sorts of dark deeds occurring behind closed doors. The absence of transparency created a vacuum that was quickly filled by rumor and speculation, much like how an empty room can make the smallest creak sound like a monstrous growl. When you don't know what's going on, your imagination tends to fill in the blanks, and it rarely fills them with pleasant things. Furthermore, their very independence from secular rulers became a point of contention. Monarchs, particularly those like King Philip IV of France, who were eager to consolidate royal power and reduce any competing authority, viewed the Templars as an anomaly, an obstinate block in their path to absolute control. Such kings wouldn't necessarily start rumors, but they certainly wouldn't do anything to stop them. In fact, they might subtly encourage them, recognizing how public distrust could serve their own political ends. If the people already believed the Templars were shady, it would be much easier to justify taking action against them later. The Templars themselves, perhaps due to their ingrained secrecy, or perhaps a touch of arrogance born from centuries of power, did little to dispel these growing rumors. They rarely engaged in public relations or tried to explain their practices to the common folk. They likely believed their long history of service to God and Christendom would speak for itself, that their reputation was unassailable. This silence, however, only served to deepen the mystery and allow the malicious whispers to fester and grow, transforming mere speculation into what many would soon believe were undeniable truths. These whispers, subtle at first, began to build into a crescendo of suspicion and fear, forming a dangerous psychological climate across Europe. They laid the crucial groundwork, creating a public mood where the unthinkable could suddenly seem plausible, where accusations, no matter how outlandish, could find receptive ears. This insidious campaign of character assassination, combined with the desperate financial needs and ruthless ambition of one particular king, would soon coalesce into a thunderclap that would shake the foundations of medieval Europe, signaling the Templars' final tragic chapter. The stage was set for their swift and brutal downfall, proving that even the strongest can be felled by a concerted campaign of disinformation and the calculated machinations of power. The insidious whispers about the Knights Templar, festering in the European imagination, found their most eager and dangerous audience in King Philip IV of France, often known as Philip the Fair. This wasn't just a king looking for a quick buck. Philip was a monarch obsessed with power, centralization, and, crucially, solvency. His reign was characterized by relentless efforts to consolidate royal authority, often at the expense of powerful feudal lords, the church, and, as it turned out, enormously wealthy religious orders. He was, in essence, a medieval CEO determined to streamline his kingdom's finances and crush any potential rival, and he saw the Templars, with their independent wealth and direct papal allegiance, as a glaring obstacle to his grand vision. Philip's primary motivation was quite simply money. He was perpetually, chronically in debt. Imagine running a country, funding multiple wars against England, against Flanders, and various other conflicts, and maintaining a lavish court, all without a stable, modern tax system. It was an endless scramble for funds. He had already resorted to debasing the currency, persecuting Jews and seizing their assets, and taxing the clergy to the point of outrage. And yet, his treasury remained stubbornly empty. He was desperate, and a desperate king is a dangerous king, especially when he casts his gaze upon an organization whose vaults were rumored to be overflowing. The Templars, ironically, were not just wealthy, they were Philip's bankers. The Paris Temple, their main headquarters in France, served as the royal treasury, a massive, impregnable fortress-like compound where Philip kept his crown jewels, his tax revenues, and perhaps, most tellingly, a running tally of his astronomical debts to the order. He owed them a fortune, a sum so vast it likely dwarfed his annual income. Picture this. You owe your bank so much money that you start thinking, wouldn't it be easier if the bank just disappeared? That, essentially, was the terrifying calculation Philip began to make. His designs on the Templars were not a sudden, impulsive whim. They were part of a calculated, ruthless strategy. He couldn't simply seize their assets. The Templars were under direct papal protection, and any direct attack would incur the wrath of the Church, a power even Philip was wary of provoking head-on. No, he needed a pretext, a justification so compelling, so horrifying, that it would force the Pope's hand and sway public opinion. This is where those earlier whispers and rumors about heresy, idolatry, and blasphemy became incredibly useful. Philip began to systematically gather information, or rather, fabricate it. He employed agents, most notably Guillaume de Nogaret, a ruthless and brilliant jurist who was fiercely loyal to the king and utterly devoid of scruples. Nogaret was a master of legal manipulation and political maneuvering, the kind of person you definitely wouldn't want on the opposing side of an argument, especially if that argument involved your life and liberty. He orchestrated the infamous Anagni outrage, where Pope Boniface VIII was publicly humiliated and assaulted, demonstrating Philip's willingness to go to extreme lengths to assert his will over the papacy. With Boniface gone and a new, more pliable pope, Clement V, installed under French influence, Philip's path became clearer. The king's strategy was chillingly simple. Accuse the Templars of heresy. Heresy was the ultimate crime in medieval society, punishable by burning at the stake and the confiscation of all property. More importantly, those convicted of heresy lost all papal protection. If the Templars could be branded as heretics, their immense wealth, currently protected by the Church, would become legitimate spoil for the crown. It was a perfect storm. Desperate royal finances, a king with a track record of ruthlessness, a legal mastermind willing to do his dirty work, and pre-existing public anxieties about the Templars' secrets and wealth. Philip carefully cultivated his narrative, collecting evidence from disgruntled former Templars or those with grudges against the order, often under torture or the promise of reward. He disseminated these tales, allowing the rumors to solidify into what appeared to be genuine, damning accusations. He began to apply subtle, then not so subtle pressure on Pope Clement V, who had relocated the papacy to Avignon, effectively placing him under the shadow of French royal power. Clement, a weak and indecisive pontiff, was caught between his duty to protect a holy order and his overwhelming fear of Philip's wrath. The stage was now meticulously set. Philip had built his case, crafted his narrative, and softened up his primary target, the Pope. He had identified the Templars as the perfect scapegoat for his financial woes and a convenient obstacle to his absolute power. What happened next was not a spontaneous uprising or a justified legal proceeding, but a meticulously planned, state-sponsored ambush designed for maximum shock and minimal resistance. The net was tightening around the Knights Templar, and they, perhaps, in their long history of facing down external threats, failed to recognize the true insidious nature of the danger that now came from within, the very heart of Christian Europe, orchestrated by the man who owed them everything. The meticulous planning of King Philip IV, coupled with the escalating whispers and his relentless pressure on Pope Clement V, culminated in one of the most shocking and coordinated acts of state-sponsored persecution in medieval history, the arrests of 1307. Imagine, if you will, the early morning hours of Friday, October 13th, 1307, across the length and breadth of France, while most people slept soundly in their beds. A carefully orchestrated, perfectly synchronized operation was underway, designed to capture every single Knight Templar and seize their immense assets simultaneously. It was a pre-dawn raid on an unprecedented scale, a masterclass in clandestine execution that would make even modern intelligence agencies nod in grudging admiration. Orders, sealed and secret, had been dispatched weeks earlier to royal officials, seneschals, and bailiffs in every corner of France. These directives were so highly classified that their contents were known only to a tiny inner circle, including the ruthless Guillaume de Nogaret, Philip's chief minister, who was likely the architect of this grand scheme. The sealed envelopes were only to be opened at a precise moment, just before dawn on that infamous Friday the 13th, a date that some superstitions suggest has been unlucky ever since, thanks to the Templars. This level of secrecy and coordination across a vast pre-modern kingdom was truly extraordinary, reflecting Philip's obsessive determination and the efficiency of his burgeoning centralized bureaucracy. As the morning mist still clung to the ground, royal officers, accompanied by armed guards, descended upon Templar preceptories, commanderies, and even individual knights' residences. Knights, often still in their beds or at morning prayers, were roused roughly and immediately arrested. They were given no warning, no chance to resist, no opportunity to escape, and certainly no explanation beyond vague accusations of heresy and blasphemy. It was a swift, brutal, and thoroughly disorienting shock to the system for an order that had considered itself virtually untouchable. The primary target was, of course, the Paris Temple, the massive fortress-like compound that served as the Templars' European headquarters and, ironically, the royal treasury. Grand Master Jacques de Molay, the venerated head of the order, was captured there along with many senior officials and knights. He was an elderly man by this point, likely weary from years of defending a lost cause, and suddenly faced with the unimaginable horror of his life's dedication being torn apart by the very king he had served. The sheer audacity of arresting the Grand Master of such a powerful, respected order sent ripples of disbelief across Europe. It was like kidnapping the CEO of a global corporation and simultaneously freezing all their assets. Utterly unthinkable. Crucially, Accompanying the arrests was the immediate seizure of all Templar property, their lands, their castles, their treasury, their movable goods, their archives, and their vast stores of gold, silver, and precious artifacts. Royal officials meticulously documented everything, taking inventory of the immense wealth that had so long been the object of Philip's covetous gaze. This wasn't just about putting knights in prison. It was about systematically dismantling the entire infrastructure of an immensely powerful organization and transferring its assets to the crown, a process that Philip hoped would finally pull him out of his crippling debt. The justification for these sweeping arrests, as announced by royal decree immediately afterward, was shocking. The Templars were accused of the most heinous heresies imaginable. They were charged with denying Christ, spitting on the cross during their secret initiation ceremonies, worshipping idols, the infamous Baphomet, engaging in sodomy, and other unspeakable acts. These were precisely the rumors that had been carefully cultivated for years, now given official damning weight. The accusations were designed to horrify the devout Christian populace and to strip the Templars of any public sympathy or moral authority, making them seem like a truly monstrous conspiracy rather than a venerable religious order. The arrests were carried out with such efficiency and secrecy that very few Templars managed to escape the dragnet in France. Those who did flee were usually the ones not present at a commandery or who received a last-minute desperate warning. This near-total success speaks volumes about the meticulous planning by Philip's agents and the centralized control he exerted over his kingdom. It also highlights the Templars' own unpreparedness for such a direct and ruthless attack from a Christian monarch. They had spent centuries fighting infidels, not plotting against kings. The initial reaction across Europe was one of stunned disbelief. How could such a respected, pious order, which had shed so much blood for Christendom, be guilty of such abominable crimes? Pope Clement IV, while under Philip's immense pressure, was initially outraged by the arrests, which had been carried out without his explicit permission. The Templars, after all, were directly under papal authority, and Philip's actions were a blatant challenge to the Pope's ecclesiastical jurisdiction. However, Clement, weak and residing in Avignon under Philip's shadow, found himself in an impossible position. He protested, he equivocated, but ultimately, the king's grip was too strong and his financial needs too great to ignore the tantalizing prospect of the Templars' wealth. The arrests of 1307 were not the end, but the brutal beginning of a prolonged and torturous ordeal for the Knights Templar. It was the first act in a chilling drama, designed to extract confessions, validate the charges, and ultimately justify the complete dissolution of the order and the seizure of its vast properties. The stage was now set for the infamous trials, where justice would be a distant dream, and the desperate cries of tortured men would echo through the dungeons, solidifying Philip's manufactured truth. With the Knights Templar now languishing in French dungeons, their vast wealth seized, the next chilling act in King Philip IV's meticulously orchestrated downfall of the order began: the systematic application of torture and forced confessions. Imagine being snatched from your life of service, locked in a dark, cold cell, and then subjected to unimaginable pain, all to extract a predetermined narrative. This wasn't about finding truth. It was about manufacturing it, coercing innocent men into admitting to the most grotesque and blasphemous crimes imaginable, thereby providing Philip with the legal justification he so desperately needed to liquidate the order. The royal agents, under the direction of Guillaume de Nogaret and the Grand Inquisitor of France, Guillaume de Paris, were given free rein to use any means necessary to secure confessions. And in the early 14th century, any means necessary typically meant excruciating torture. Methods designed not to kill, but to break the human spirit and body until compliance was the only escape from agony. We're talking about techniques that would make even a hardened criminal flinch. The strappado, where victims were hoisted by their wrists, often with weights tied to their feet, dislocating their shoulders. The rack, which stretched the body to its breaking point, and the dreaded fire test, where feet were roasted over an open flame. It sounds utterly barbaric to our modern ears, and frankly, it was. Under such duress, many Templars, brave warriors though they were, eventually cracked. Faced with unbearable pain, the promise of relief, and the knowledge that resistance was futile, they confessed to everything their interrogators wanted to hear. They admitted to denying Christ, spitting on the cross, worshipping a pagan idol, the infamous Baphomet, engaging in sodomy, and other acts of heresy and immorality. These confessions, however, were strikingly similar across different Templar houses, often echoing the exact phrasing of the charges leveled against them, which raises a colossal red flag to any historian worth their salt. It wasn't independent testimony. It was a script being read under duress, a horrifying performance coerced by tormentors. Consider the sheer psychological trauma of it all. These were men who had dedicated their lives to Christ, many of whom had fought valiantly for decades in the Holy Land, risking their lives for the very faith they were now being forced to deny. The psychological torment of betraying their deepest beliefs, even under duress, must have been almost as agonizing as the physical pain itself. It's almost impossible for us to truly comprehend the level of terror and desperation that would lead a devout knight to confess to spitting on the cross, something that would have been anathema to their very being. Grand Master Jacques de Molay, though an old man, was subjected to similar treatment. While the exact details of his torture are debated, it is clear he suffered immensely. His initial confession, extracted under duress, corroborated some of the accusations, a devastating blow to the order's reputation, and a massive propaganda victory for Philip. When the head of the order admitted to such vile practices, who could argue against the king's righteousness? This particular confession was paraded across Europe as irrefutable proof of the Templars' guilt, convincing many who might otherwise have been skeptical. However, not all Templars confessed immediately, and some never did. There were those who steadfastly maintained their innocence, enduring the torture with incredible fortitude, often paying the ultimate price. Many died in prison or under interrogation, their bodies broken, their spirits unbroken. But their defiance was largely ignored by Philip's determined machinery of justice. The confessions, whether freely given or coerced, were all that mattered. They were the legal fuel that would power Philip's campaign to dismantle the order and claim its vast fortune. The problem for Philip was that these confessions, extracted in France, were often recanted once the Templars were out of the immediate clutches of their torturers and brought before papal inquiries. As soon as the direct threat of the rack or the fire was removed, many Templars bravely retracted their forced statements, declaring their innocence and exposing the brutal methods used against them. This created a huge dilemma for Pope Clement V, who, despite his subservience to Philip, still held ultimate ecclesiastical authority. He couldn't simply ignore these recantations, as it would expose the entire process as a sham. This back and forth, with confessions being made and then retracted, would complicate the Templar trials immensely and highlight the inherent injustice of the proceedings. It also put Clement in an increasingly uncomfortable position, caught between a powerful, ruthless king who demanded quick results and the moral and canonical obligations of his office. Historians still argue about the true extent of the Templars' alleged heresies. Almost all modern scholars agree that the confessions were extracted under extreme duress and are therefore unreliable, if not outright fabricated. The evidence points overwhelmingly to their innocence of the most egregious charges, but for Philip, the confessions, however obtained, served their purpose. They provided the public justification, the legal veneer, for what was essentially a massive act of state-sponsored plunder. The tales of their depravity, however unbelievable, resonated with a public already primed by whispers and distrust. The horror of the confessions, spread far and wide, paved the way for the Pope's reluctant, but ultimately decisive action against the order, proving that sometimes the most dangerous weapons aren't swords or armies, but manufactured truth wielded by a desperate and ruthless king. With the Knights Templar languishing in French prisons, their coerced confessions echoing through the halls of power, the immense pressure shifted squarely onto the shoulders of Pope Clement V. Imagine being the spiritual leader of Western Christendom, yet finding yourself essentially a puppet of a ruthless king, forced to choose between upholding justice for a venerable order and protecting the very institution of the papacy from political annihilation. Clement's position was unenviable, a precarious tightrope walk between divine authority and very earthly, very dangerous royal power. Clement V was not a strong pope. He had been elected to the papacy in 1305, largely due to the influence of King Philip IV, who ensured the election of a French cardinal who would be pliable to his will. The papacy itself had recently moved to Avignon in France, placing it firmly under the shadow of the French crown, a move that significantly weakened its independent authority and made Clement highly susceptible to Philip's machinations. It's like living in your powerful neighbor's guest house. You might have a fancy title, but you're still subject to their rules, and more importantly, their whims. Initially, Clement was outraged by Philip's unilateral arrests of the Templars. He argued that the order was directly under papal jurisdiction, and the king's actions were a blatant usurpation of ecclesiastical authority. He demanded that the Templars be handed over to the Church for proper canonical investigation, not subjected to royal tribunals and torture. For a brief period, it seemed Clement might actually stand up to Philip, perhaps even excommunicate him, as previous popes had done to unruly monarchs. But Philip was no ordinary king, and Clement was no innocent third. Philip, ever the master manipulator, responded with a potent mix of flattery, intimidation, and, crucially, the threat of accusing the papacy itself of complicity in the Templars' alleged heresies. He even went so far as to suggest posthumous charges against Pope Boniface VIII, Clement's predecessor, an action that would have utterly shattered papal authority and legitimacy. This was a direct, existential threat to the Church itself, a chilling reminder that Philip was willing to go to any lengths to get his way. Faced with such overwhelming pressure and witnessing the confessions extracted by Philip's torturers, Clement began to buckle. The sheer volume and consistency, however coerced, of the Templars' admissions, especially the alleged spitting on the cross and denial of Christ, deeply disturbed him and many within the Church. While he suspected foul play, the accusations were so grave, so utterly blasphemous, that he felt compelled to investigate. Perhaps, he reasoned, there was some truth to these horrifying charges, and he couldn't risk appearing to protect heretics. In August 1308, Clement issued the papal bull Faciens Misericordiam, which essentially suspended the royal inquisitions and ordered that the Templars be brought before papal inquisitors. This was a small victory for Clement, a feeble attempt to reassert papal authority. However, this bull also explicitly acknowledged that the confessions, even if forced, had raised serious questions about the order's orthodoxy. It was a concession to Philip, effectively giving credence to the charges. The papal investigations were, however, excruciatingly slow. Unlike Philip's swift and brutal methods, the Church's judicial process, though flawed, was meant to be more deliberative. Templars who had recanted their coerced confessions often did so before papal commissioners, exposing the torture they had endured. This created a massive headache for Clement, as it undermined the credibility of the entire case against the Templars. Imagine the frustration. Here are these men retracting their confessions, making the whole thing look like a royal frame-up, while Philip is breathing down your neck, demanding action. Philip, impatient with the slow pace of the papal inquiries, ratcheted up the pressure. He initiated another wave of royal tribunals, specifically targeting those Templars who had recanted their confessions. These knights were declared relapsed heretics, meaning they had confessed, then denied their confession, a crime punishable by burning at the stake. This was a horrifyingly effective tactic, designed to send a clear message: confess and perhaps live. Recant and surely die. It was a truly Machiavellian move, forcing Clement's hand and chilling anyone who might dare to speak the truth. The most famous example of this was the fate of 54 Templars burned at the stake in Paris in May 1310 for recanting their confessions. This public spectacle, a horrifying display of royal power and brutality, sent shivers down the spine of every Templar still imprisoned and every church official involved in the process. It was a clear demonstration that Philip would stop at nothing to achieve his objective, and that Clement's authority was severely limited when it clashed with the king's ruthless will. Ultimately, Clement V, facing the unyielding pressure from Philip, the seemingly damning confessions, however obtained, and the threat to the papacy itself, succumbed. He convened the Council of Vienne in 1311, a general council of the Church, to decide the fate of the Templars. While many at the council were skeptical of the charges and expressed concern about the injustice of the proceedings, the overwhelming political reality was that Philip would not back down. The spectre of those 54 burned Templars undoubtedly loomed large over the assembled clergy. On March 22, 1312, Clement V officially dissolved the Order of the Knights Templar with the papal bulwarks in excelso. He did so, notably, not by condemning them for heresy. He still acknowledged the lack of conclusive proof of their guilt, but per modum provisionis, by way of ordinance, or as a provisional measure. He stated that the order had acquired a bad reputation, its utility was questionable, and that its continued existence posed a threat to the Church due to scandal. It was a face-saving measure for the papacy, an acknowledgement of immense political pressure, rather than a clear declaration of Templar guilt. Historians still argue whether Clement had any real choice, or if he was simply a tragic figure caught between an irresistible force and an immovable historical legacy. But the outcome was clear. The Knights Templar, after nearly 2 centuries of service, were formally extinguished by the very authority that had originally sanctioned them, paving the way for the seizure of their assets and the final tragic fates of their leaders. With Pope Clement V's reluctant but ultimately decisive dissolution of the Order of the Knights Templar via the papal bulwarks in excelso in 1312, the subsequent trials and accusations against individual Templars became a chaotic and often contradictory affair, playing out across various European kingdoms with vastly different outcomes. Imagine a legal proceeding where the verdict is essentially predetermined, but the specifics of how to get there are still being frantically worked out, leading to a dizzying array of legal battles, political maneuvering, and desperate attempts by the accused to defend themselves against a seemingly unstoppable tide. In France, under King Philip I's iron fist, the trials were largely a sham. The initial arrests and tortures had already extracted the desired confessions, and the subsequent proceedings were designed to legitimize these admissions. The Templars, brought before royal and inquisitorial courts in France, faced a brutal choice: either reaffirm their forced confessions and face perpetual imprisonment, or recant and face the horrific charge of relapsed heresy, which, as we remember, meant an almost certain death by fire. Many, in a desperate bid to save their lives, stuck to their coerced tales, hoping for mercy that rarely came. The psychological toll must have been immense, a constant battle between truth and survival. The most prominent of these trials was that of the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, and his senior officers. Despite initially confessing under torture, de Molay and others, once given a slightly more public platform, often found the courage to recant their forced statements, powerfully affirming the order's innocence and denouncing the torture they had endured. These recantations, however, only infuriated Philip and his henchmen, who viewed them as defiant acts of heresy. It was a truly catch-22 situation. Tell the truth and die, or lie, and perhaps live in shame. Outside of France, the situation was far more varied. Pope Clement V, in his dissolution bull, had ordered all Christian rulers to investigate the Templars within their own territories. However, many monarchs, while not entirely immune to Philip's pressure, were less enthused about conducting their own witch hunts, especially if they didn't owe the Templars as much money as Philip did, or if they had their own political reasons for not wanting to antagonize such a powerful, respected order. In England, for example, King Edward II, Philip's son-in-law, was initially reluctant to act against the Templars. He respected the order and saw little evidence of wrongdoing. However, under intense pressure from Philip and Clement, he eventually ordered arrests and investigations. Yet the English trials were notably less brutal. While some Templars were interrogated and even subjected to soft torture, like prolonged starvation or sleep deprivation. The widespread, systematic use of torture seen in France was largely absent. Consequently, the English Templars largely maintained their innocence, and none were found guilty of heresy or executed. They were often forced to transfer to other monastic orders or live out their days in retirement, a far less severe fate than their French brethren. Historians still argue whether Edward II's reluctance was due to a genuine belief in their innocence or simply a desire to assert his own royal prerogative against papal and French interference. In Aragon, Spain, the Templars actually put up armed resistance, retreating to their fortified castles and enduring sieges before eventually surrendering. The Aragonese trials, similar to England's, found little compelling evidence of heresy. Many Templars there were acquitted or simply transferred to other military orders, like the Order of Montesa, founded specifically to absorb Templar assets and personnel. In Portugal, King Dinis I, valuing the Templars' military prowess against the Moors, simply renamed the order the Order of Christ, effectively preserving their structure and much of their wealth, a truly cunning move to circumvent the papal decree. Even in Italy, where papal authority was theoretically strongest, the trials yielded mixed results. Some Templars were acquitted, while others, particularly those closer to French influence, faced harsher judgments. The disparity in outcomes across Europe vividly illustrated that the heresies were largely a fabrication of Philip IV, rather than a widespread blight within the order. It underscored that the charges were a means to an end, a legal and moral justification for an act of state-sponsored greed. The accusations themselves were often ludicrous and contradictory, the product of terrified men desperately trying to satisfy their torturers. For instance, some confessions detailed kissing rites on the navel, while others mentioned spitting on an idol or denying Christ 3 times. The variations and absurdities were glaring to anyone not blinded by fear or malice. Yet these bizarre details, rather than discrediting the entire process, often seem to confirm to the public that something truly dark and secret was at play within the Templars' hidden rituals. The legacy of these trials is complex and enduring. They set a grim precedent for the power of the state over religious institutions and individuals, demonstrating that a ruthless monarch with enough political leverage and a willingness to use torture could bend even the Pope to his will. They also fueled the enduring mystery and fascination with the Templars, as the very absurdity of the charges, coupled with the dramatic downfall of such a powerful order, left many unanswered questions in the popular imagination. The world watched, horrified and captivated, as the curtain slowly drew to a close on the once mighty Knights Templar, setting the stage for the final tragic act of their Grand Master. The long drawn-out nightmare for the Knights Templar reached its chilling crescendo with the final tragic fate of their last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay. Imagine an old warrior, a man who had dedicated his entire life to a sacred cause, now facing the ultimate betrayal, the complete destruction of everything he stood for, and a public execution orchestrated by the very king he had served. His story is perhaps the most poignant and devastating symbol of the Templars' downfall, a grim testament to the ruthlessness of power and the fragility of justice. De Molay, who had been arrested along with his senior officers on that fateful Friday the 13th in October 1307, had endured years of brutal imprisonment and torture in France. Like many of his knights, he had initially confessed to some of the outlandish charges leveled against the order, undoubtedly under immense physical and psychological duress. These confessions, however extracted, were a major propaganda victory for King Philip IV, as the head of the order admitting guilt seemed to validate the entire royal campaign. He was paraded as proof, his words, however coerced, echoing through the courts and across the kingdom. For years, de Molay remained imprisoned as the various trials and papal inquiries dragged on. He witnessed the systematic dismantling of his beloved order, the scattering of its members, and the seizure of its vast wealth. He heard of the fates of his knights, the tortures, the burnings, the forced confessions, and the desperate struggle for survival. It must have been an unbearable burden, a slow, agonizing process of watching his life's work reduced to ashes. Then, in March 1314, after more than 6 years of imprisonment, Grand Master Jacques de Molay, along with Geoffroy de Charnay, the preceptor of Normandy, and 2 other senior Templar officials, were brought before a final commission of cardinals and theologians on the Île aux Juifs, Isle of the Jews, in the Seine River, right outside Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. This was meant to be the final act of their public humiliation, where they would publicly reaffirm their confessions and receive their sentences of perpetual imprisonment, effectively sealing the Templars' narrative as a heretical order. The crowd gathered, eager to witness the final condemnation of these once mighty figures. But what happened next was utterly astonishing. A moment of profound courage and defiance that defied all expectations and must have sent shivers down the spines of Philip's agents. As the cardinal began to read out the verdict, expecting meek submission, Jacques de Molay, frail and aged, suddenly found a final, incredible surge of strength and courage. In a clear, resonant voice that reportedly silenced the crowd, he publicly, unequivocally, and passionately recanted his confession. He declared, with unwavering conviction, that the accusations against the Templars were false, that the order was innocent of heresy, and that his earlier confession had been made solely to escape torture. Geoffroy de Charnay immediately followed suit, similarly retracting his confession and reaffirming the innocence of the order. It was a stunning act of defiance, a bold repudiation of Philip's manufactured truth, delivered at the very moment it was least expected. Imagine the gasp from the crowd, the fury on the faces of Philip's officials, and the sheer terror in the hearts of the cardinals, who suddenly found their carefully constructed narrative crumbling before their eyes. This public recantation was a direct challenge to King Philip IV's authority and his carefully constructed narrative of Templar guilt. It exposed the entire judicial process as a sham, a cruel farce built on lies and torture. Philip was absolutely incandescent with rage. He immediately convened a royal council, bypassing any further ecclesiastical proceedings, and swiftly condemned de Molay and de Charnay as relapsed heretics, a crime punishable by burning at the stake. This was a king making an example, sending an unmistakable message to anyone who dared to defy his will. On the evening of March 18th, 1314, some sources say March 11th or 19th, Jacques de Molay and Geoffroy de Charnay were led to a small island in the Seine, near the royal gardens, and burned alive at the stake. Imagine the scene: the flickering flames casting long dancing shadows against the twilight sky, the smell of smoke and burning flesh, the silent, horrified crowd watching as two old men, once symbols of Christian might, perished in agony. Legend says that as the flames consumed him, de Molay cried out, cursing both Pope Clement V and King Philip IV, summoning them to appear before God's judgment within a year and a day. Whether this dramatic curse actually occurred is, of course, debated by historians, but it quickly became an enduring part of the Templar legend, adding a layer of supernatural retribution to their tragic end. Interestingly, both Pope Clement V and King Philip IV did indeed die within a year of de Molay's execution. Clement in April 1314 and Philip in November 1314. A coincidence that cemented the curse in the popular imagination and fueled belief in divine justice. The execution of Jacques de Molay was the brutal, bloody exclamation point at the end of the Knights Templar's long and illustrious history. It was an act of pure political expediency, a calculated murder designed to silence the most vocal opponents of Philip's fabricated narrative and to solidify his seizure of the Templars' immense wealth. While the order had been formally dissolved by the Pope, de Molay's defiant death and the subsequent eerie fulfillment of his alleged curse ensured that the Templars would forever remain shrouded in mystery, controversy, and enduring fascination, setting the stage for the redistribution of their vast properties and the endless speculation about their hidden treasures. With the last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, having met his fiery end, and the major figures of the order either dead, imprisoned, or scattered, the formal dissolution of the order became a grim reality, codified by Pope Clement V's papal bull Vox in Excelso in 1312. This wasn't just a simple disbanding. It was a comprehensive dismantling of a powerful centuries-old institution, a process that involved the meticulous redistribution of their vast assets and properties across Europe, leading to complex legal wrangles and unexpected windfalls for various entities. The papal bull explicitly stated that the Templar order was being dissolved, not necessarily because their guilt was unequivocally proven. Clement was careful to avoid that definitive judgment, but per modum provisionis, by way of ordinance, meaning for the good of the Church and to prevent scandal. It was a political maneuver designed to appease Philip IV and bring an end to the tumultuous affair, even if it meant sacrificing a venerable order. The bull essentially declared that the Templars, due to their tarnished reputation and the scandals surrounding them, were no longer fit to serve as a military order. It was like saying, "You're not fired for doing something wrong, but because everyone thinks you did something wrong, so we need to let you go." The core of the papal decree regarding their assets was that the Templars' properties, both movable and immovable, should be transferred to the Order of the Knights Hospitaller of St. John. This was a shrewd move by Clement, seemingly designed to maintain the wealth within a military order dedicated to the Holy Land, and to prevent powerful secular rulers from simply seizing everything. The Hospitallers were the Templars' chief rivals, but they were also a similar order, also dedicated to fighting in the East, and presumably they would continue the Templars' work, even if they sometimes grumbled about it. It was, in theory, a way to preserve the spirit of the Crusades and utilize the Templars' immense fortune for its intended purpose. However, the reality was far more complicated and messy. Philip IV, having gone to such extreme lengths to destroy the Templars, had no intention of letting their vast wealth simply slip through his fingers and into the hands of another order, even a papal-sanctioned one. He argued that since the Templars had been arrested and their property seized within his kingdom, those assets rightfully belonged to the French crown as compensation for the immense costs of the investigations and imprisonments. It was a classic case of finders keepers, but on a truly grand royal scale. What ensued was a complex and protracted legal and political battle across Europe over the Templar estates. In France, Philip managed to retain a significant portion of the Templars' wealth, demanding substantial reimbursement for his expenses and keeping prime properties for the crown. The Hospitallers, while theoretically inheriting everything, often had to pay large sums to various monarchs to actually take possession of the lands, effectively buying back property that was supposedly their rightful inheritance. It was a bureaucratic nightmare, a giant medieval yard sale where the buyer had to pay off the previous owner, the police, and the entire neighborhood just to get their stuff. Historians still argue about the exact percentage of Templar wealth that actually made it to the Hospitallers versus what ended up in royal coffers. But it's clear Philip got a very sizable chunk. Outside of France, the situation varied wildly. In kingdoms like Portugal and Aragon, as mentioned before, the local monarchs simply created new military orders, such as the Order of Christ in Portugal and the Order of Montesa in Aragon, to absorb the Templars' assets and manpower. This was a clever way to bypass the papal decree, maintain the Templars' military capabilities, and keep their wealth within the kingdom under royal control, rather than letting it go to the Hospitallers or back to the papacy. It was essentially a rebranding exercise on a national scale, a clear demonstration of how secular power could subvert papal authority when it suited their interests. In England, after some initial delays and investigations, the Templar lands were eventually transferred to the Hospitallers, but not without significant legal battles and financial demands from the English crown. The process was slow, cumbersome, and riddled with disputes, taking years to fully implement. In other parts of the Holy Roman Empire, some Templar assets were indeed transferred to the Hospitallers, while others were simply retained by local nobles or rulers. The actual Templar knights who survived the purges faced various fates. Some, like those in Portugal, were simply integrated into the new orders. Others, particularly in France, were forced into other monastic orders, often Cistercian houses, where they lived out their days under strict surveillance, forbidden from ever speaking of their past. As Templars, a few managed to disappear into the general population, shedding their distinctive white mantles and melting away into anonymity, leaving behind no trace of their former lives. Their stories remain largely untold, lost to the relentless march of history. The dissolution of the order had far-reaching consequences. It significantly increased the power and wealth of the Hospitallers, making them the dominant military order in the Mediterranean for centuries to come, eventually relocating to Rhodes and later to Malta. It also set a dangerous precedent for royal interference in ecclesiastical affairs, demonstrating that a powerful, ruthless king could, through sheer force of will and manipulation, destroy even the most venerable and powerful religious institution. It sent a chill through other independent organizations, reminding them that no one was truly beyond the reach of a determined monarch. But the sheer magnitude of the Templars' wealth and the abrupt, brutal nature of their demise inevitably fueled one of history's most enduring mysteries. What happened to the Templar treasure? This vast fortune, so meticulously accumulated and so abruptly seized, seemed to vanish, or at least its complete accounting never quite satisfied the eager eyes of those who sought it. This lingering question would ignite centuries of speculation and give birth to countless legends, ensuring that the Knights Templar, even in their dissolution, would continue to captivate the imagination. The official dissolution of the Knights Templar and the rather muddled redistribution of their vast properties inevitably birthed one of history's most enduring and captivating mysteries. What exactly happened to the fabled Templar treasure? Imagine an organization that operated the world's first international banking system, accumulated staggering wealth over 2 centuries, and then seemingly vanished overnight. Its vaults emptied just before, or perhaps just after, the king's men arrived. It's a tantalizing puzzle, isn't it? A riddle wrapped in an enigma, cloaked in the mists of medieval intrigue, and it has fueled centuries of speculation, desperate hunts, and countless works of fiction. The official story, of course, is that King Philip IV of France, after arresting the Templars, diligently seized all their assets in his kingdom, while the remaining properties were eventually transferred to the Hospitallers as per papal decree, albeit often after paying Philip a hefty fee for custody. In theory, every last coin, every last deed, every last ounce of silver was accounted for. But reality, and particularly historical reality, is rarely so neat and tidy, especially when immense wealth is involved and desperate people are looking for answers. Here's where the mystery really begins to sparkle. Contemporaries of the Templars, including Philip himself, were convinced that the order possessed a far greater treasure than what was officially found and seized. Philip's agents reported that many Templar houses, particularly the Paris Temple, seemed to have been cleared out of their most valuable movable assets, like gold, silver, jewels, and precious documents, just before the arrests on that fateful Friday the 13th. Imagine a bank vault emptied, not by robbers, but by the very people who managed it, minutes before a hostile takeover. This discrepancy between the expected and the actual recovered wealth became the bedrock of the Templar treasure legend. One of the most persistent theories suggests that the Templars, somehow forewarned of Philip's impending attack, managed to spirit away their most valuable assets. How could they have known? Perhaps through their extensive intelligence network, or perhaps through sympathetic allies within the French court or even the papacy. The idea is that convoys of wagons laden with chests of gold, silver, and priceless artifacts vanished into the night, disappearing without a trace. Where would they go? This is where the theories really diverge and get delightfully creative. One popular notion is that a significant portion of the treasure was loaded onto Templar ships and sailed to safety. The Templars, remember, had a substantial fleet operating across the Mediterranean and even, perhaps, into the Atlantic. Some theories suggest these ships sailed to Scotland, which at the time was excommunicated by the Pope and therefore less likely to enforce papal decrees or Philip's demands. Could a hidden Templar fleet have found refuge in the misty lochs and remote islands of Scotland, burying their treasure somewhere in the rugged highlands? It's a romantic thought, conjuring images of secret ceremonies and buried hoards beneath ancient stones. Other theories point to hidden caches within their vast network of castles and commanderies. While the major Templar treasuries were ostensibly seized, could smaller, hidden chambers or secret passages have concealed portions of their wealth? Perhaps under an obscure floorboard, behind a loose stone in a forgotten well, or deep within a labyrinthine dungeon, chests of gold, forgotten relics, and priceless manuscripts still await discovery. Every old Templar ruin, it seems, has its own local legend of buried treasure, a testament to the enduring power of the mystery. Then there's the more esoteric, less tangible treasure. Beyond mere gold and silver, some theories suggest the Templars possessed invaluable historical and religious artifacts. Could they have hidden the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, or other sacred relics believed to have been brought from the Holy Land? Or perhaps they guarded ancient knowledge, secret texts, or even the true lineage of Christ. These theories, while highly speculative and lacking any concrete evidence, fuel the imagination, elevating the Templar treasure from mere material wealth to something far more mystical and profound. This is where you get into the Dan Brown territory, complete with secret codes and ancient puzzles. Historians, of course, tend to be a bit more grounded. While acknowledging the possibility that some movable assets were indeed secreted away, they generally point out that a vast international banking system relies on visible, accessible wealth. Secreting away everything would have crippled their operations long before Philip struck. Moreover, the scale of their operations meant that most of their wealth was tied up in land, properties, and loans to monarchs. Assets that were difficult, if not impossible, to simply pick up and move. The treasure was less a chest of doubloons and more a balance sheet of vast, interconnected holdings. Yet the idea persists. The notion of a secret, hidden Templar treasure waiting to be rediscovered is simply too compelling to let go. It speaks to our innate desire for mystery, for the idea that hidden truths and unimaginable riches might lie just beneath the surface of the mundane. The tantalizing possibility of a vast, untapped fortune, perhaps guarded by ancient secrets or coded maps, ensures that the Templars will forever be linked with the greatest treasure hunts in history, perpetually tempting adventurers, historians, and dreamers alike to dig just a little bit deeper, setting the stage for even wilder theories about their continued existence. The tantalizing mystery of the vanished Templar treasure, coupled with the abrupt and brutal nature of their suppression, naturally led to a fascinating proliferation of survival theories and secrets. Imagine an order so powerful, so secretive, and so dedicated, simply disappearing into thin air without a trace. It simply doesn't sit right with the human mind. People love a good conspiracy, and when the official narrative feels incomplete, the imagination rushes in to fill the void with tales of clandestine escapes, hidden enclaves, and secret continuations of the order, weaving a rich tapestry of speculative history. One of the most enduring theories posits that a core group of Templars, perhaps forewarned, managed to escape Philip's dragnet in France and establish themselves elsewhere. As we discussed, A few did indeed escape, and the arrests were largely confined to French territory. This opens the door to the intriguing possibility that these survivors regrouped, not necessarily to fight open wars, but to continue their sacred mission in secret, passing on their knowledge, their rituals, and perhaps even some of their fabled treasure from generation to generation. It's the ultimate underground resistance narrative, isn't it? A testament to their resilience and defiance. Scotland is a particularly popular destination in these survival theories. Why Scotland? Well, in the early 14th century, Scotland was excommunicated by the Pope due to its ongoing wars with England. This meant that papal bulls, including the one dissolving the Templars, held less sway there. It's plausible, therefore, that Templars fleeing persecution in France and England found a safe haven in Scotland, where King Robert the Bruce, himself excommunicated, would have had little incentive to persecute them, and perhaps even a keen interest in their military expertise and financial resources. Some legends even link Templar Knights to the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, where Robert the Bruce famously defeated the English, suggesting Templar military prowess turned the tide of the battle, though direct historical evidence for this remains elusive and hotly debated. Imagine a small contingent of highly disciplined Templars appearing from the mists to strike a decisive blow for Scottish independence. It's a compelling image, even if it's likely more myth than reality. Another facet of these survival theories involves the idea that the Templars simply went underground, transforming themselves into a secret society. They couldn't operate openly, given the papal dissolution and royal persecutions, so they adapted. Perhaps they continued their banking operations in a more discreet manner, financing discreetly. Or perhaps they became guardians of esoteric knowledge and ancient secrets they had accumulated during their time in the Holy Land. This taps into the deep human fascination with secret societies and hidden truths. The idea that there's more to the world than meets the eye, and that certain powerful groups pull strings from the shadows. Some theories link the surviving Templars to the development of Renaissance banking and finance. Having pioneered international credit and financial systems, it's plausible that former Templars, or individuals influenced by their methods, continued to apply this knowledge, contributing to the evolution of modern financial practices. While direct lineage is hard to prove, the Templars undoubtedly laid some of the groundwork for later financial institutions, whether or not their personnel directly transitioned into them. It's a more mundane, but perhaps more historically plausible, form of survival. Then there are the more fantastical, often pseudo-historical, theories that connect the Templars to an incredible array of later phenomena. They are sometimes implicated in the discovery of the New World, with claims that Templar fleets, or their descendants, reached America long before Columbus, perhaps carrying their treasure or ancient knowledge. You also hear whispers of their involvement in the construction of the Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, with its intricate carvings and mysterious symbolism, supposedly containing hidden Templar secrets. These theories often blur the lines between history, folklore, and outright fantasy, yet they contribute significantly to the enduring mystique of the order. The very lack of definitive answers about their complete wealth and the precise fate of every Templar knight leaves a gaping hole that conspiracy theories are eager to fill. The idea that something so powerful and influential could simply vanish without a trace, defies common sense for many, and so they seek deeper, hidden explanations. Historians, while generally skeptical of the more outlandish claims, acknowledge that the Templars' wealth was never fully accounted for, and that some individuals certainly escaped the purges, living out their lives under different guises or in new, less scrutinizing environments. The Templars' commitment to secrecy, a characteristic that defined them throughout their existence, ironically helped to fuel these very survival theories, because so much of their internal operations were cloaked in mystery. It was easy for later generations to imagine that even more profound secrets lay hidden, just waiting to be uncovered. This cultivated air of enigma, combined with their dramatic downfall, ensured that the Knights Templar would never truly disappear from the popular imagination. Instead, they would be reborn in countless legends, paving the way for their significant, though often historically distorted, legacy in later secret societies. The enduring fascination with the Knights Templar, particularly the idea of their clandestine survival, has undeniably cast a long shadow, inspiring and often intertwining with the history and mythology of later secret societies, most prominently Freemasonry. Imagine a venerable, mysterious order, supposedly destroyed, whose legend becomes so potent that subsequent generations invent elaborate narratives connecting themselves to its glorious and tragic past. This isn't about direct, unbroken historical lineage, mind you, but rather a powerful symbolic inheritance, a desire to tap into the mystique and perceived wisdom of a lost age. Freemasonry, a fraternal organization with roots tracing back to the late 17th and early 18th centuries in Europe, shares many superficial and thematic similarities with the popular image of the Templars. Both are characterized by secretive rituals, hierarchical structures, moral teachings, and a strong emphasis on brotherhood and mutual support. This convergence, whether accidental or intentional, provided fertile ground for the Templar legacy to flourish within Masonic lore. It's like finding two puzzle pieces that look like they should fit together perfectly, even if they actually came from different boxes. The most direct and explicit connection between Freemasonry and the Templars exists within certain higher degrees of the Masonic Rite, particularly in what is known as the York Rite or the Scottish Rite. In these advanced degrees, Masons can symbolically become Knights Templar, participating in elaborate ceremonies that reenact aspects of Templar history, including their valiant deeds in the Holy Land and their tragic suppression. These degrees are entirely allegorical and symbolic. They are not claiming a direct, unbroken organizational lineage from the medieval Templars. Instead, they use the Templar narrative as a powerful moral and philosophical framework for their own teachings on courage, loyalty, and perseverance in the face of adversity. It's a bit like a historical reenactment society, but with more arcane symbolism and secret handshakes. So while a modern-day Knight Templar within Freemasonry doesn't literally trace his lineage back to Jacques de Molay, he certainly draws inspiration from the medieval order. The rituals often focus on themes of justice, martyrdom, and the unwavering defense of truth, reflecting the Templars' perceived virtues and their ultimate sacrifice. The black and white colors, the Red Cross, and even the Baphomet, though reinterpreted as a symbol of wisdom rather than idolatry, make appearances in various symbolic forms. enriching the experience for those who delve into these higher degrees. The adoption of Templar imagery and lore by Freemasonry wasn't necessarily a deliberate fabrication to deceive. It was more likely a natural evolution, a fascination with a historical enigma that resonated with their own fraternal ideals. In an era when historical research was less rigorous and Romanticism held sway, it was easy to draw connections between seemingly disparate elements. The Templars, with their dramatic rise and fall, their aura of secrecy, and their reputation for guarding hidden knowledge, were simply too compelling a story to ignore. They offered a ready-made narrative of ancient wisdom and heroic struggle that fit perfectly with the Masonic search for enlightenment and moral improvement. However, historians generally draw a clear distinction between the medieval Knights Templar and modern Freemasonry. There is no documented historical evidence of a continuous, unbroken organizational link between the two. The Templars were extinguished in the early 14th century, while Freemasonry emerged much later. The notion of a direct lineage is largely a product of Masonic esoteric tradition and a romanticized view of history, rather than factual historical transmission. It's important to remember that many secret societies of the 18th and 19th centuries sought to claim ancient origins to imbue themselves with greater prestige and a sense of timelessness. The Templars, being both ancient and mysteriously disappeared, were the perfect candidates for this kind of symbolic adoption. Despite the lack of direct historical continuity, the influence of the Templar legend on Freemasonry is undeniable. It has provided a rich source of ritual, symbolism, and a sense of shared heritage, even if that heritage is primarily spiritual and allegorical. This symbiotic relationship has also, ironically, fueled many of the wider conspiracy theories about both organizations, leading some to believe that Freemasonry is the direct, secretive continuation of the Templars, still guarding their hidden treasure or manipulating world events from the shadows. This enduring connection, whether historical or mythical, ensures that the Knights Templar continue to live on, not just in academic texts, but in the vibrant, secretive world of fraternal organizations. It speaks to the power of their story, a narrative so compelling that it transcends its historical confines, continuing to inspire, mystify, and even perplex those who seek to understand the hidden currents of history and the enduring power of symbolism. Their presence in Freemasonry is a testament to the Templars' lasting symbolism and lore, shaping popular culture and fueling the whispers of what truly happened. Beyond the hushed lodges of Freemasonry and the earnest debates of historians, the Knights Templar have truly achieved a kind of immortality through their enduring presence in popular culture, symbolism, and lore. Imagine an organization whose very name conjures images of mystery, chivalry, ancient secrets, and hidden riches. Centuries after its demise, they're everywhere, aren't they? From blockbuster movies to video games, from historical novels to graphic novels, the Templars have transcended mere historical fact to become a powerful archetypal force in the collective imagination. It's like they found a way to become truly immortal, not through hidden enclaves, but through relentless cultural replication. The iconic imagery of the Templars is instantly recognizable. The white mantle emblazoned with the bold red cross, the disciplined warrior monk, stoic and unyielding. This visual shorthand instantly communicates ideals of purity, sacrifice, and martial prowess. It's a powerful brand, even if they didn't know they were building one. This striking imagery lends itself perfectly to visual storytelling, making them ideal protagonists or antagonists in tales of adventure, conspiracy, and spiritual quest. You see it everywhere, from children's books to elaborate cosplay at fan conventions. Their aura of secrecy, cultivated during their active years and magnified by their abrupt downfall, is a goldmine for storytellers. The idea of hidden rituals, arcane knowledge, and a clandestine network operating in the shadows is inherently captivating. This secret society aspect allows for endless narrative possibilities. What did they really know? What did they really do behind closed doors? This mystery invites speculation, allowing authors and filmmakers to weave elaborate plots around ancient enigmas, giving audiences a tantalizing glimpse into a world beyond ordinary perception. It's the ultimate what-if scenario, playing out on screens and pages around the globe. The infamous accusations of heresy, idolatry, and blasphemy, however false they were, have also contributed significantly to their dark mystique. The idea that these supposedly pious knights were secretly worshipping a demonic idol like Baphomet or performing unholy rites adds a delicious layer of forbidden knowledge and moral ambiguity. It gives them an edge, making them more complex and intriguing characters than mere straightforward heroes. This darker side fuels narratives where the Templars are not always the good guys, or where their moral compass is, shall we say, a bit wonky. And then, of course, there's the treasure. The enduring legend of a hidden Templar fortune, whether it be gold, relics, or ancient texts, is perhaps the greatest single driver of their popular appeal. Everyone loves a treasure hunt, and when the treasure is tied to a secret society, a holy war, and a brutal suppression, the stakes are incredibly high. This treasure is often portrayed as something far more than mere wealth. It might hold the key to untold power, world-altering secrets, or even the truth about the nature of reality itself. It's why you'll find them searching for the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy Grail, or even ancient alien technology in various fictional narratives. Modern media has capitalized immensely on this rich vein of Templar lore. Think of the Assassin's Creed video game series, where the Templars are reimagined as a shadowy organization relentlessly pursuing control, standing in stark opposition to the assassin's quest for freedom. Or the National Treasure movies, with their puzzles and conspiracies, often hinting at Templar connections. Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, while largely fictional and historically inaccurate, brought the Templars into the mainstream consciousness for millions, cementing their image as guardians of profound religious secrets. Even television shows, historical dramas, and countless novels continue to explore every conceivable angle of their history and mythology. The Templars also resonate because they represent a clash of ideals: faith and power, military might and spiritual devotion, secrecy and public service. Their story, with its dramatic rise and fall, provides a compelling narrative arc that speaks to timeless themes of ambition, betrayal, sacrifice, and the corrupting influence of wealth and power. They are a cautionary tale as much as they are an inspiring legend. Their dramatic execution, particularly that of Jacques de Molay, provides a satisfying, if tragic, endpoint to their historical journey. Yet paradoxically, it also ensures their continuous rebirth in the realm of myth. Historians still argue whether this widespread popularization helps or hinders a true understanding of the historical Templars. On one hand, it keeps their story alive and sparks interest in medieval history. On the other hand, it often prioritizes sensationalism over accuracy, blurring the lines between fact and fiction to an almost comical degree. But regardless of scholarly purism, the fact remains: the Knights Templar, despite being dissolved over 700 years ago, are more famous and perhaps more culturally influential now than they ever were during their actual existence. They are a permanent fixture in our collective imagination, a testament to the enduring power of a good story, a compelling mystery, and a truly epic rise and fall, leaving us with lingering questions that historians, even now, continue to debate. And so we arrive at the crossroads of our historical journey, peering back at the enigmatic Knights Templar, an order whose rise was meteoric and whose fall was catastrophically sudden. Despite centuries of meticulous scholarship, mountains of documents, and countless passionate arguments, historians still argue whether the traditional narrative fully captures the complex truth of their story, leaving us with lingering questions and fascinating scholarly debates that continue to shape our understanding of this legendary order. It's like a perpetually unfinished puzzle, where every new piece only seems to reveal more tantalizing questions. One of the most enduring debates revolves around the true extent of their alleged heresies. While Philip IV's motivations for wealth and power are widely accepted as the primary drivers behind the Templars' downfall, some historical voices still ponder whether there was any kernel of truth to the accusations of blasphemy, idolatry, or strange initiation rites. Were these merely inventions of a desperate king and his ruthless inquisitors, or did certain practices within the secretive order, perhaps misunderstood or misinterpreted, provide accidental fodder for their accusers? The sheer consistency of some confessions, despite the use of torture, continues to be a point of minor contention for a few scholars, though the overwhelming consensus leans heavily towards forced fabrication. Another major point of contention is the role and true intentions of Pope Clement V. Was he a weak, craven puppet, entirely manipulated by King Philip IV, or was he a pragmatic pontiff, making a difficult, calculated decision to sacrifice the Templars to save the papacy from potentially catastrophic damage at the hands of a truly dangerous monarch? Historians still debate the extent of his agency. Some argue he was a victim of circumstance, doing what he believed was necessary for the survival of the Church. Others paint him as complicit, valuing his own safety and political standing over justice and truth. His phrase, per modum provisionis, dissolving the order by way of ordinance, rather than condemning them outright for heresy, certainly gives ammunition to both sides of that argument. The question of the Templars' true wealth and its ultimate fate also remains a lively topic. As we've discussed, the discrepancy between what was seized and what was widely believed to exist continues to fuel endless speculation. Did a significant portion of their treasure genuinely vanish into the shadows, spirited away by forewarned knights? Or was their wealth largely tied up in illiquid assets, like land and loans, making the grand treasure a largely mythical concept? While most scholars lean towards the latter, the tantalizing idea of hidden hoards ensures this debate continues to sparkle, drawing treasure hunters and amateur historians into its alluring orbit. You can almost hear the faint clink of phantom gold coins if you listen closely enough. Furthermore, there's ongoing discussion about the true impact of the Templars' financial prowess. Were they simply astute medieval bankers providing a necessary service in a chaotic era? Or did their immense financial power make them dangerously independent, inadvertently contributing to the envy and resentment that led to their destruction? Was their banking system truly revolutionary, or simply a sophisticated adaptation of existing practices? Historians still unpick the intricacies of their economic model and its precise influence on nascent European capitalism. Perhaps the most fundamental debate, however, centers on the Templars' ultimate purpose in the wake of the Crusader state's collapse. Could they have successfully transitioned into a new role in Europe, perhaps as a standing army, a banking institution, or a naval force? Or was their very existence as an independent military religious order with immense wealth and direct papal allegiance simply an anachronism in a rapidly changing European landscape where powerful, centralized monarchies were asserting their dominance? Some argue their demise was inevitable, a natural consequence of shifting geopolitical realities, while others maintain that their destruction was a singular act of monumental injustice, a tragedy that need not have occurred. Another nuanced discussion centers on the Templars' military effectiveness. While undeniably brave and disciplined, were they truly the invincible warriors of legend, or were their victories often exaggerated by a chronicler's pen? How much did their rivalry with the Hospitallers truly hamper the defense of Outremer? And how effective were their renowned fortifications against the increasingly sophisticated siege techniques employed by their Mamluk adversaries? These questions invite ongoing re-evaluation of their strategic and tactical contributions to the Crusades. Finally, the relationship between the historical Templars and later esoteric or fraternal groups, particularly Freemasonry, remains a subject of intense academic and public interest. While most historians dismiss direct lineal continuity, the cultural impact of this alleged connection is undeniable. How much did the Templars' idea influence these later groups, even without a factual link? And what does this enduring cultural fascination tell us about our own human need for mystery, ancient wisdom, and the allure of secret societies? These are not easy questions, and centuries later, definitive answers remain elusive. The story of the Knights Templar, therefore, is not a closed book, but an ongoing conversation, a tapestry still being woven by new discoveries, fresh perspectives, and the relentless curiosity of those who seek to understand one of history's most dramatic and perplexing narratives. And in that very ambiguity, in that ongoing debate, lies much of their enduring power and allure, inviting us to keep pondering the mysteries of their incredible journey. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And now, as the echoes of forgotten battles and whispered secrets fade into the quiet of the night, allow yourself to drift. Imagine the ancient stones of their castles, worn smooth by time, standing silently under the moonlight, holding their secrets forever. Feel the distant whispers of knights, long gone, their vows a faint breeze across the centuries. The Templars, though their order was dissolved, their leaders burned, and their treasure dispersed or simply vanished, continue to exist, not in a hidden fortress or a secret lodge, but in the realm of stories, in the quiet corners of history, where courage meets tragedy and legend intertwines with fact. Their journey, a testament of faith, power, and ultimately, a brutal betrayal, now gently recedes into the realm of dreams, leaving only the soft glow of a forgotten era. Rest well, and may your own dreams be filled with far less intrigue and far more peace.